Section 1 of the Rover, Volume 1, Number 3. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by AllenO and Para. The Rover, Volume 1, Number 3, edited by Seba Smith and Lawrence Labree. Section 1. The Miller of Corbeil. Corbeil, with its fertile and vine-crowned banks rising above the Seine, uncontaminated by the pollutions poured forth thereafter into its glassy waters by a filthy capital. Corbeil, which as Bologna is termed the Fat, might assuredly be called the mealy Corbeil, whose villas line the shore with their well-trimmed avenues of limes, and here and there a shrub dipping down into the stream to shelter the baths constructed by the diverse proprietors in the bed of the river. The prosperous little town is neither so ornate in its environs as Richmond, nor so stately in its domiciles as Hampton Court, but the wooded heights of Saint-Germain rise majestically above its suburbs, and if a palace be lacking, it boasts an edifice still more unique and almost as imposing, the celebrated Mill of Corbeil. It happened that at the period immediately preceding the frightful epoch of the French Revolution, the Tremblay had brighter things to boast of than its golden carp, purer things than even its crystal fountains. The little farm, concealed within its cozy nook, was tenanted by a worthy wight named Mathieu, whose two daughters enjoyed the envied appellation of the Roses of Corbeil. It is impossible to conceive two lovelier creatures, or two more resembling each other in person, more thoroughly dissimilar in character and disposition. There was but a year's difference between them in age. There was a century's in sentiment. Manette, the elder sister, was a light, lively, gay-hearted creature, riante as the landscapes of Corbeil. Justine, the younger, with the same blue eyes, the same silken hair, the same trim ankle and well-formed figure, was sad and sober. And the neighbors, who noted among themselves her gravity of aspect, were apt to attribute it to the influence of the broken constitution of the mother, who died of a pulmonary disorder in giving her birth. Both sisters, however, by the discretion of their deportment, strengthened the high distinctions attained by their beauty, and Mathieu, although watchful over the two nymphs of the Tremblay as a miser over his gold, was not afraid to let his daughters take their stand on market days upon the Place de Notre Dame of Corbeil. With their fair faces shaded by the wide straw hats in use among the peasants of the departments of the Seine-et-Oise, to preside over the sale of the vegetable produce of his farm, and more especially over the stand of garden flowers and exotics, the pride of the gay parterre surrounding the limpid bath of the Reine Blanche. Manette was a great adept in the art of persuasion to a customer. Recommended by her animated accent and laughing eyes, his stalest melons and greenest grapes were readily purchased by the Parisian cockneys who came down to Corbeil to swallow a mouthful or two of country air, and whatever else Providence might send them, while Justine, an expert florist, had so much to say, and said it so gently and well, touching the culture of her clove pinks and geraniums, that there appeared every probability of Mathieu being enabled to add a second cow to his pastures, and another brood or two of ducks to the clear ponds of the Plaisance in the course of the summer. Everything prospered with them. While the father busied himself with the cares of his farm, the daughters contrived to render it available. The barley mow and the hayrick diminished, the beds of ranculises and tulips were bereft of their brilliant show. But Mathieu's long leather purse grew heavier, his linen press was stocked, and at length he took his pipe at even as well as morning-tide, without much self-reproach on the score of economy. He even made the girls partakers of his gains, and Justine had the happiness to secure from her earnings a weekly mass for the spiritual repose of her mother at the altar of the Sacré-Cœur in the church of Saint-Spier. Manette, however, had other objects to which to devote her superfluous wealth. Manette was young and pretty enough to be curious in the lace of her pinners and the lawn of her kerchief. It was observed one day, as she took her usual stand on the marketplace, that she exhibited a pair of long gold earrings under her straw hat, and that a cross of gold was suspended to the black velvet which habitually encircled her slender throat. And one or two of the most censorious of the ladies of the Faubourg, who were accustomed to exchange a few civil words with the Roses of the Corbeil, while they had laid in their stock of mignonettes, soon turned disdainfully away when they noticed this accession of finery. Mademoiselle Benoit, indeed the squinty-eyed daughter of a retired notary of Saint-Germain, was heard to whisper that it was no wonder Manette of La Tremblay grew so fine, now that she was rowed over the river so often by young Monsieur Clairvaux of the 12 Moulins. And now that young Monsieur Clairvaux of the 12 Moulins found the fountains of La Tremblay so refreshing during the midsummer heats, the prudes and scandalmongers were determined to espy mischief in the innocent coquetry of poor Manette. One sultry summer afternoon, however, the young girl herself happened to overhear these insinuations of her customers when she not only pettishly removed from her person the ornaments which had caused them to arise, but instantly took her way homeward, sobbing with indignation and leaving to her sister the disposal of her merchandise and the task of remonstrating with her detractors in extenuation of Manette's proceedings. "Now well know, Mademoiselle Benoit," said Justine in her usual mild, conciliating tone, "that if Monsieur Clairvaux finds his way to La Tremblay, it is only in the way of business for his father's mill, and much against my sister's inclinations. You, who are a kinswoman of his family, cannot but be aware that Manette has more than once complained to the old gentleman of the importunities of his son." "Is it in the way of business for the mill," retorted the provoked spinster, "that my cousin Clairvaux escorts Mademoiselle Manette to all the ducats of the neighborhood? Charlet the ferryman related to me only yesterday that he had himself encountered the young people one evening after dusk." But her accusations were cut short. The looks of Justine warned the evil speaker that some person of importance stood beside her, and as Mademoiselle Benoit turned hastily round, the large dark eyes of Felix Clairvaux scowled her into silence. Manette, having met him lounging as usual upon her path homeward to the farm, had appealed to his justice against the insolence of his cousin. Nor did she hesitate to assail him with her usual epithets of female disdain, and the revenge of Felix was to wreak upon the aged virago threefold the measure of ill usage he had received from the object of his affections. It was not everyone, however, who would have adventured so boldly as Manette to vent reproaches on Felix Clairvaux. Felix was a man whom, if few people loved, most people feared, although in every way extrinsically endowed to win affection, and only qualified to excite apprehension by a sort of taciturn reserve, inspiring involuntary mistrust of his temper and disposition. He was chargeable with no act of violence, no act of injustice. He was charitable, generous, humane, yet his associates, one and all, refrained from making him their friend, and from the singular motive that they felt convinced he was capable of becoming a bitter enemy. And thus it was that few people loved Felix. He was the son of Clairvaux, the rich Miller of Corbeil, but he was nothing more. Clairvaux's whole life had been spent in the task of money-getting and money-sparing, and the pastime of deceiving the world of the extent of his gains and his savings. No one, not even his son, had the most remote idea of the amount of Clairvaux's property. But when it was rumored in Corbeil that he had made overtures for an alliance between Felix and Mademoiselle de Montigny, co-heiress of the Château de Saint-Paul, the gossips of the town decided he must be a bolder or richer man than they had previously imagined, the aristocratic de prefixed to the name of the young lady being equivalent to the value of at least 30,000 crowns in a marriage contract with the son of the Miller of Corbeil. Neither the distinction it imparted, however, nor any other attraction sufficed to overcome the opposition of Felix to the match. While Mademoiselle Benoit and her crew were busy in computing what amount of wealth could justify the Clairvauxs in pretending to so grand a connection, the young man explicitly declared to his father his determination to wed elsewhere. This might have been held sufficient provocation, but when Felix came to particularize that the partner he had chosen was no other than pretty Manette, the twin Rose of Corbeil, the gardener's daughter of La Tremblay, the wrath testified by Clairvaux against his son was easily accounted for. The cast-off prejudices of the great usually descend to the little, and at a time when even the peerage of France was beginning to republicanize, when Versailles itself had declared in favor of the natural equality of the human species, it was time for the miller to disdain the interalliance of his family with that of a market gardener. Nor could an emperor of Germany, insulted by the determination of his son, the king of the Romans, to espouse the daughter of some petty baron of the empire, have shown himself more fiercely indignant than old Clairvaux. "I had already heard from our cousin Benoit," cried he, "that it was inferred in the town no good would come of your everlasting visits to the Stiver farm yonder, over the water. But look you, Master Felix, if ever again you set foot upon the turf of the Tremblay, I will assuredly put the width of my threshold between you and me for evermore. Aye, sir, and marry again, Mademoiselle de Montigny, perhaps, why not the father as well as the son? And beget sons and daughters who shall not thwart me in my old age, although they share my inheritance with my elder and more stubborn child." "You cannot do better, sir," replied Felix, without moving a muscle of his handsome but impassive countenance. "Although you deny my choice, I am far from inclined to find fault with yours. Marry Mademoiselle de Montigny. Disinherit me if you will. I have still 2 strong arms and as strong a heart to enable me to get my own living and pursue my own inclinations." And Clairvaux, well aware of the obstinacy of his son's resolves, gave over the case for lost, and even made a solemn progress to the Chateau de St-Pol to offer his apologies to the family of Montigny and tender the retraction of his proposals. Yet, in spite of this resignation and these formal measures, all hope of the alliance was not at an end. Old Clairvaux had an abettor in his projects on whom he little calculated. He could not be more firmly determined that Felix should never become the husband of the gardener's daughter than Manette, that she should never become the wife of the miller's son. No! It was not for him that she had added the offending trinkets to her costume, or folded the snowy lawn upon her bosom. It was not for him that she loitered by the way on the road from La Tremblay to the market-place. It was not for him that she ensconced her well-turned foot in slippers of Spanish Morocco to dance upon the greensward at the annual fête of Saint Etienne at Essonne. There were other attractions at the Mill of Corbeil than the homage of Felix Clairvaux, and Mathieu's daughter, so inaccessible to the addresses of one who wooed her with the stern gravity of a Spanish hidalgo, or rather with the jealous but impassioned tenderness of an Ursman, had given her heart with very little asking to young Valentine, the son of Charlet, the ferryman of Corbeil. As has been already observed, the prejudices of the great are eagerly adopted by the little, and the rich miller could not express himself more vehemently against his son's attachment to the daughter of the market gardener than did the market gardener in his turn on hearing his daughter's engagement to the son of a poor ferryman of the Seine. Clairvaux wished to marry Felix to the high-born Clarice de Montigny, Mathieu to marry Manette to the wealthy Felix. Clairvaux threatened to disinherit his son. Mathieu threatened to horsewhip his daughter, and when the evening succeeding the general éclaircissement, Felix rode over to La Tremblay, and having fastened his boat to the usual stump, made his way toward a stone bench among the acacias, where often at the same hour he had found the 2 daughters of Mathieu together, now talking, now listening, sometimes to each other, sometimes to the gurgling of the springs among the grass, or the whistling of the blackbirds in the groves of Saint-Germain. He was bitterly taxed by Manette with the indignities he had been the means of drawing upon her endurance. "It is a cruel thing of you, Monsieur Felix," said she, "to persist in persecuting me thus, after I have again and again told you that were you Count of Corbeil, or the King of France himself, I would never be your wife. And now you have provoked my father to misuse me, the first time he ever breathed a harsh word against either of his children. I do but detest you the more." "Hate me and welcome," said Felix in an unaltered voice. "I have heard you say as much before, and been nothing moved. But never till today, never till from your father's lips this morning, did I learn that you preferred another, that you stooped to bestow the love denied to me upon yonder beggar, the son of a beggar, the hireling drudge of my father's mill. What in heaven, what on earth, do you see to move your affection in such a fellow as Valentine? Answer me, Manette, what do you see to like in Valentine?" "That if he were rich,
Like yourself, Monsieur Felix Clairvaux, he would not always be thinking of riches and giving the name of beggar as a word of reproach to others less fortunate than himself, for Valentine has the heart of a prince.
Truly a ragged prince, and with a precious cabin for his palace, retorted the miller's son, at once justifying her accusation. As you will find when you take your place yonder in Charlet's hovel, among the 10 half-fed, half-clothed brats who call him father.
And who, even for that scanty food and scanty clothing, are indebted to the labor of Valentine,
added Manette with firmness.
Of Valentine, who, when his work at the mill is over, comes back to his father's hut with a smile upon his face and a song upon his lips, and instead of grumbling and murmuring that his limbs are aching with toil, sits down cheerfully to his osier weaving or mat work, or during the summer season rows off as stoutly as though his arms had not done a turn of work through the day, to cut reeds for the thatchers or the tile-makers. And for what does he labor? To lay up hoards for himself, or to purchase the means of selfish pleasure? No, Monsieur Felix, no! To get bread for his paralytic mother, raiment for his brothers and sisters, rent to requite your own purse-proud father for the use of the miserable hut you hold so cheap. Proud as you are of your fortune, your very means have been swelled by his industry.
Manette, whispered the gentle Justine, laying her hand imploringly upon her sister's shoulder.
You know not how great an injury you may be doing Valentine. I understand you,
replied Manette aloud,
although you are afraid to speak out. You mean that Monsieur Felix will be a powerful, malicious enemy to him. Courage, courage, sister. Valentine, by the sweat of his brow and the labor of his hands, earns wages from the Miller of Corbeil, but he is not, therefore, the slave of either Clairvaux or his son. There is nothing to fear for Valentine, nor any reason why I should not acquaint the gentleman who is base enough to taunt him with beggary, that I would rather make one in the hovel by the riverside among its merry inmates and the warm hearts that would welcome me so kindly, than play the lady in a cold, narrow-minded family of Clairvaux, where the only cheerful sound is the clack of their own mill.
By this time the soul of Felix was overflowing with rage. He made no allowance for the irritability of a quick-tempered girl, opposed for the first time in her inclinations, but attributed every word uttered by Manette to malice prepense, to preconceived bitterness such as that engendered by the viper nature of his kinswoman, Mademoiselle Benoît, and had no doubt that such injurious expression that she had lavished upon him and his were in habitual use between herself and Valentine, her father's hireling. On her, indeed, he could avenge nothing, but him. Felix ground his teeth for rage as he thought of Valentine, but he uttered not a syllable. His wrath was silent as it was deadly, and the stillness was only interrupted by the sobs of Manette, whose petulance, as usual, exhausted itself in tears.
Father,
cried she, suddenly starting up from Justine's pacifying embraces, as the footsteps of Mathieu were heard approaching the bench on which they sat.
I beseech you, command Monsieur Felix Clairvaux to quit this place. You explained to me this morning the wickedness of children presuming to disobey their parents. You will not surely encourage a son to rebel against his father. Clairvaux has laid his injunctions on Felix to visit La Tremblay no more. You have pride too, father. Surely you will not stoop to have it said that you laid snares to seduce a raw, inexperienced boy into marriage with your daughter.
And who will dare to say so? Ejaculated the young man, trembling with suppressed rage at the epithets bestowed upon him.
Your own kinswoman, Mademoiselle Benoît, has said so 1,000 times.
Mademoiselle Benoît is an accursed fool, cried old Mathieu, and young Clairvaux saw no cause to dispute the assertion.
But you cannot surely, my dear father, wish Monsieur Felix to get into trouble by his visits to La Tremblay,
said Justine mildly, a question to which the gardener-farmer found it so difficult to reply that he leant down on pretext of caressing the shaggy-looking cur which was accustomed to lag at his heels, rather than venture on a direct answer. "And how is my father to hear of them?" demanded Clairvaux, haughtily bending his brow.
"Thus,"
replied Justine, pointing through the dusk, now gathering round them, to the approaching figure of a man bending under the weight of a sack of meal, who, on putting down his burden and raising his head as he proceeded to wipe his streaming brows, presented to their view the homely features but prepossessing countenance of Valentine, while Charlet's son, startled to find his young master thus apparently domesticated with Mathieu, and his daughters, yet in no wise daunted by his presence, cheerfully saluted the party. "What are you doing here, sir?" demanded Felix in an angry voice. "Obeying the orders of the overseer, Monsieur Felix," replied the young man, "who bade me bring over—" "Is this a time for doing your mill work?" interrupted Felix. "I shall represent tomorrow to my father that you defer the execution of his business till after hours, in order to suit your own whims and convenience." "You will represent what you please, sir," answered Valentine. "But one honest man's word is as good as another's, and Monsieur Bernardin, the overseer, has known me too well from a boy upward as a truth-teller and fair dealer not to credit my assurance that every minute of my morning's time was spent in my duty to my employer. If I have pushed the boat over to La Tremblay to deliver Monsieur Mathieu his meal this evening instead of tomorrow morning as I was directed, it is only because I desired to offer him the bonsoir and my respects to the young ladies." "Your respects and your salutations are not wanted here, my lad," growled Mathieu. "If you had brought me the couple of crowns I have had to score up against your father for milk and meal furnished to your family, you would have done something more to the purpose." And Mathieu, excited by the desire of saying a vexatious thing to the pauper who had presumed to lift his eyes to his pretty Manette, renounced the generous intention of his better nature to make a free gift to the needy family of the overflowings of his cruse of plenty. "Do not fancy I come empty-handed," said Valentine mildly, but drawing up with conscious pride as he tendered the payment of the 2 crowns to the more prosperous farmer, and Manette's heart beat till it was ready to burst her bosom for joy that her lover was able to redeem himself from humiliation in his rival's presence. "If I have delayed thus long, Monsieur Mathieu, it is that grievous sickness has arisen in my family from the damps of the season, Monsieur Clairvaux's workman having neglected to repair the roof of our hut according to his covenant. But remember that although the cost of drugs and doctors may have kept us in your debt, it has not caused me to break my word. I promised you payment at midsummer, and Saturday next is the eve of Saint Jean." "Good, Valentine, good," replied Mathieu, jerking the money into his pocket, and ashamed of the meanness in which he had been betrayed. "You are an honest lad, and I have naught to say against you in your way. But your way is not mine, and I do not intend to make it so. Henceforward I shall beg Monsieur Bernardin to choose some other of his mill lads to do what business may chance to stand between us, and charge my old friend Charlet to lay his injunctions on yourself not to be gadding about upon idle errands of evenings, or at least not upon premises of mine." "You have said enough, Master Mathieu," answered Valentine, involuntarily glancing toward the 2 girls, who stood overcome with grief and embarrassment, leaning on each other under the acacia trees. "I am well aware to whom I am indebted for this sudden change of welcome, and shall take an opportunity to thank the talebearer who, for some time past, has been base enough to play the spy upon my actions." "You lie!" vociferated Felix, upon whom the accusing looks of Valentine were now directed. "You lie like a dog!" "Coward that you are, in daring to use such words to me!" cried the young man, suddenly smiting a violent blow upon his own breast. "When you know that I cannot raise my hand against you so long as the bread eaten by my family is provided by your father's wages. You have also their beggary to thank for screening your insolence from chastisement," said the contemptuous Felix. "And as you seem to be in no condition to play the hero, beware in future how you assume the braggart."
"Valentine, dear Valentine!"
exclaimed Justine, throwing herself before young Clairvaux to intercept the spring which she perceived Valentine on the point of making upon his person.
"Remember your poor mother! Remember your 6 sisters!"
"Let me go!" cried he, struggling in the silent embrace of Manette, which not even her father's presence sufficed to check when she saw her lover on the eve of rushing into violence, the inevitable ruin to himself and his family. "Let me go. Let me not live to have it said of me that I dared not defend myself against the insults of a villain." Then dashing forward and again, as suddenly checking himself, he burst into tears and covered his face with his hands, while he exclaimed, "He is right. I dare not strike him. I dare not lay my hand on the son of the Miller of Corbeil. I was born too poor to indulge in the sense of justice and honor. The walls that shelter us are his father's walls. The food we eat springs from him. Father, mother, brothers, sisters. This is the hardest thing I have had to bear for your sake."
"Never mind him, Valentine. Be of good cheer, dear Valentine,"
sobbed Manette, her sensitive nature excited to the utmost pitch of violence by his distresses.
"Let him be as rich and audacious as he will. I hold him but a dastard and a beggar. From me he will obtain nothing, Valentine, nothing but scorn and detestation. Poor as you are, so poor will I be. Despise you as they may, I honor you, I revere you, I love you. My father may drive me forth, my friends disown me, but they have urged me on into defiance by their misdoings toward you. Valentine, dear Valentine, hear me, hear your wife, and leave this man to the rebukes of his own conscience."
Sad was the scene that ensued upon this open violation of parental authority, but Valentine had not the affliction of seeing the woman he loved savagely entreated by her enraged father. For a while Mathieu was engaged in driving back his daughter to the farm and locking her into her room. Felix and himself were entwined in a deadly struggle, a struggle that left him for a few seconds breathless and senseless on the turf, for the athletic Clairvaux was as much the superior of the ill-nourished, overtasked Valentine in personal strength as in worldly endowments. Young Baptiste, a hind employed upon the farm, attracted to the spot by the tumult of the scuffle, proceeded to raise him from the ground, while Felix hastily made off toward Corbeil. But when Valentine recovered the effect of his stunning fall sufficiently to comprehend what had passed, and to feel he had been engaged in an altercation with his master's son, which would probably end in the ruin of his whole household, he wrung his hands for very bitterness. "Would that I were dead," he ejaculated as he took his way back to his father's ferry boat. "Macharat has sworn to bestow his daughter upon another. Monsieur Clairvaux will eject my mother from her habitation when he learns what has occurred. My intemperance will seal the fate of my family without obtaining me the hand of Manette. Would that I were dead. Better be in my grave than thus a burden to myself and all the world."
"Be of good cheer, Valentine," cried the lad Baptiste, who had followed and was aiding him to unmoor his boat. "Mamselle Manette loves you in spite of them all. Mamselle Manette has promised that she will one day be your wife."
"No, no wife, no house, no hope, no rest. I was born with the curse of God upon my soul," uttered the ferryman's son, looking up to the sky, where the faint flashes of a summer storm was already streaming, as if in impious reproach to the Omnipotence who had created a wretch so miserable. "I was born to eat the bread of toil and bitterness. What matters it that such an outcast should cease to live?" And it came to pass that every petulant word uttered by Valentine to the farm lad Baptiste during that brief colloquy was eventually inscribed in the judicial archives of the country, with the view of throwing light upon the incidents following the quarrel of that fatal night. Old Charlet's son never again set foot upon the turf of La Tremblay. Valentine was mistaken, however, in supposing that his dispute with Felix would ensure his dismissal from the mill of Corbeil. Either old Clairvaux saw no cause for displeasure in his conduct, or Felix had generously, or perhaps discreetly, forborne to prefer a complaint against him. When, at the ringing of the work bell the following morning, he presented himself as usual among the men, not a word of remark was made on the subject by Bernardine, the overseer. Valentine had been cutting rushes on the river by early as daylight in order to repair, to the best of his own abilities, the dilapidated roof of the hovel, from whence he so much dreaded to witness the ejection of his family, and heartsick with labor and fasting, he was scarcely able to support the struggle of his feelings on ascertaining that his rashness had not been the means of immediate injury to his sick and feeble mother. In the course of the day, he had still stronger evidence that no displeasure existed against him in the mind of the Clairvaux, for a trustworthy messenger being needed to carry over to Labree the copy of a contract of sale for signature to one of the most extensive corn growers of the district, Valentine was chosen for the office, the usual factor being absent on pressing business at the market of Melun. Having received his instructions, he accordingly departed, and as it was held impossible for him to return to Corbeil till a late hour at night, it was settled that he should tender an account of his commission to M. Bernardin the following morning, when he was to be at the mill half an hour previous to his usual time. At that usual time, however, the work bell rang, but no Valentine made his appearance, and the young men in Clairvaux's employment began to joke among themselves, swearing that the sober Valentine must have been guilty of some excess and detained on the road. At a late hour, Bernardin dispatched one of the boys to Charlet's cottage to make inquiries, but still no Valentine had been heard of, and the old ferryman, uneasy in his turn, began to inquire on what sort of a horse his son was mounted for the expedition. A valuable one, a favorite with the master and Monsieur Felix, was the reply, but it was the temper of the beast alone and not its value that interested Charlet. The poor old man, however, had soon ample opportunity of judging for himself, for having returned to the mill with Bernardin's messenger, he found a crowd of workmen and all the idlers of the town assembled round the door of the holla adjoining Clairvaux's mill, with the horse on which Valentine had set off on the preceding day standing saddled and bridled in the midst of them.
"He's arrived, then?"
hastily inquired Charlet of one of Clairvaux's men who was lounging on the outskirts of the crowd. "No, there are no tidings of Valentine," replied the fellow carelessly, not noticing whom he addressed. "The horse has been brought home by a countryman who found him ranging loose this morning in the forest of Senart, and having rode him as far as Essons to make inquiries, found the beast recognized easily enough as the favorite bay of the Miller of Corbeil." "But Valentine!" ejaculated the old man, striking his hands together, impatient that anyone should talk of a horse when he was asking for his son. "What can have become of Valentine?" And already from all parts of the crowd the same question was arising. What can have become of Valentine? "You had better go home, Charlet," said Bernardin, when the same inquiry had been fruitlessly reiterated for 2 hours longer. "I will send word to you the first news that reaches us. Take another glass of wine, man, and do not tremble so if you can help it. No harm can have befallen your son. He had no money in his pocket, either to lead him into intemperance or to tempt any evil-disposed person to attack him. The lad has got into some foolish scrape on the road, has lost the contract, perhaps, and is afraid to return. But monsieur has sent out in every direction to seek information respecting him, and before evening, I wager my life, we know all about the matter, and that it will prove to be a thing of no manner of moment." But Bernardin was only half justified in his anticipations. Before evening, the public authorities were summoned, and a procès-verbal was drawn up, specifying the finding of the body of the unfortunate Valentine, suspended by his own handkerchief to a tree in the forest of Senart. He had destroyed himself. His imprecations of the preceding night were now remembered and recorded. It was recollected that he had declared himself weary of the world, that in his despair he had cursed his Maker as the origin of his woes. Nothing, alas, could be plainer. Valentine had blasphemed the Almighty, and straightway, like the recreant apostle, gone and hanged himself. It was noticed with sympathy by all that throughout the investigation of the case, young Clairvaux, who could not but tax himself as the unintentional cause of the misfortune, was pale as death and completely overpowered by his feelings. But if Felix sorrowed for the departed, what was the affliction of her whom he had so dearly loved, of those who so dearly loved him? What was the agony of Minette when she knew that he for whom she would have sacrificed all had incurred the guilt of the suicide? She did not hold him guilty, except indeed in leaving her behind to struggle alone with the troubles of the world, and as soon as the daylight dawned on the day succeeding that when the body of Valentine was discovered in the forest, and, after the usual forms deposited by the Marchese of Corbeil in his father's hovel, previously to interment, she set out alone for Charlet's cottage to comfort the living, to mourn over the dead. It was a grievous sight. That miserable hut standing alone in the midst of the green meadows of the borders of the Seine, like a thing abandoned to the mercy of nature. That miserable hut, whose prop was now reft away, that refuge for those who had none left to succor them, none left to minister to their wants or wipe away their tears. Mathurin's daughter lifted the latch as gently as though it were possible that any under Charlet's roof could at such a season be sleeping, and with the calmness of despair entered the house of mourning. and mournful indeed was the spectacle. There, on the only pallet, lay the paralytic mother, hiding her face in the clothes that she might not look upon the disfigured corpse of her firstborn, the mattress affording the customary bed to the children, having been already carried out and sold by the poor ferryman to secure the means of a decent burial for his boy. And there the livid body of Valentine lay stretched upon the very rushes which his own hand had cut for so different a purpose, while his little brothers and sisters, deprived of their rest and terrified and hungry, were huddled together in a corner, staring with wonder on all that was passing. Charlet, usually so reckless amid his wants and misfortunes, sat with his head drooping on his breast, and scarcely raised his eyes on Manette's entrance. Nor was it till she went close up to him, and kneeled at his feet, and called him father, and reviled herself as the cause of the mischief which had happened, that the unhappy man seemed moved to consciousness.
"Had he lived, I should have been your daughter,"
said Manette, hiding her weeping face upon his knees.
"and then all I had would have been yours. Accept it now, Charlet, for his sake," she continued, placing in his hand a small bag containing the amount of hers and Justine's earnings. "Accept it now when it can be useful, for to me worldly goods are henceforward vain."
And she wept long and bitterly, while the little children, who had been taught by Valentine to love her, crept forward and clung to her gown, and whispered to her to be comforted, for that their brother was surely with God.
"Yes, he is with God,"
said the broken-hearted old man in a hoarse voice.
"He whose loss renders these little ones worse than fatherless, and gives so bitter a pang to the poor gray-headed parents to whom he never gave pain before, must be with God. My boy may appear at the tribunal of grace with the stain of self-murder on his soul. He, who never injured mortal man, may have been moved to lift his hand against his own precious life. But heaven judges us not as we judge each other. Heaven witnessed the cares, the trials, the struggles of my poor Valentine, and noted the maddening brain, the breaking heart of the proud pauper, the tender son, the good brother, the good Christian, and heaven will forgive him." Why did he forsake us?"
ejaculated Mathieu's daughter, rising from her knees and tottering toward the body.
"Oh, Valentine, Valentine, why did you forsake me?"
And lifting up the cloth with which the pious care of the father had covered the face of the dead, she imprinted a fervent kiss upon the blue lips of him who should have been her husband, unterrified by the starting eyes, the distended nostrils, and all the ghastly evidence of his mode of death. At that moment, her father and sister, having missed her from the farm and readily conjecturing her route, entered the cottage in search of Manette. But Mathieu's displeasure against the deceased was over now, and instead of expressing dissatisfaction at his daughter's proceedings, he not only advanced with tearful eyes to sprinkle holy water on the body of her ill-starred lover, but asked permission of Charlet to follow it to the grave. The worthy Bernardine had already expressed his intention to be present at the burial ceremony, and when the remains of the warm and true Valentine were deposited in the pauper's trench of the churchyard of Saint-Germain, they were transported thither on the shoulders of his comrades, and followed by so vast a concourse of his fellow workmen and friends, that the incense of their affliction was as that of a burnt offering, calculated to propitiate the mercy of God toward the suicide. It is probable that a catastrophe so lamentable would have produced a greater sensation and elicited a closer scrutiny in a little town so uneventful in its history as Corbeil, but that the still fiercer disasters of the French Revolution had already begun in the capital, and even the tongue of Mademoiselle Benoit found a nobler topic in the misfortunes of Marie Antoinette of France than in those of the Roses of Corbeil. There was no time for sympathy in the sorrows of individuals. Clairvaux, perplexed by apprehensions lest the vast granaries of his Halle should attract the rapacity of the populace whose excesses were now every hour on the increase, gratified without hesitation, almost mechanically, the request of his son that he would assign the gratuitous use of one of his wholesome cottages to Charlet's afflicted family. Nor was it needful for Felix to covenant in return that he would seek no further intercourse with the beauty of La Tremblay. The old man, having already ascertained that from the period of Valentine's untimely end, his rival had made a sacrifice of the ill-omened connection. Even Mademoiselle Benoit was ready to avow that Monsieur Felix had altogether renounced his intention of a marriage with Manette. Meanwhile, not only Mademoiselle Benoit, but every gossip of the united community was secretly marveling over the extraordinary change that had taken place in the deportment of young Clairvaux, and one and all inferred from the haggard aspect of his face and the gradual emaciation of his person that his attachment to Mathurin's daughter had been deeper than they had imagined possible. The sacrifice of his passion was evidently preying upon his constitution. He grew languid, tremulous. His strength was failing, his temper softened. His audacious deportment had given place to mild depression instead of sharing the political enthusiasm, tiers d'état, of which he formed a part, instead of exulting in the degradation of an order which he had been accustomed to revile as his natural enemy. Felix appeared to regard with utter indifference the alarms of his father and the triumphs of the Republican party. The young man was not, however, altogether so careless as he appeared. Felix nourished in his heart an important project. Although he had done his part toward the resistance of the foreign alliance created for the suppression of civil and religious liberty in France, by supplying an active substitute to the conscription, he now determined to devote his personal services to his country. And fully aware of the opposition he was likely to experience from a parent who reverenced him as his heir fully as much as he loved him as a son, departed in secret from Corbeil to volunteer in the ranks of the Republican army. Resolved to accomplish my part as a citizen by defending the rights of the nation against the insults of the minions of Peter and Coburger, said the letter which he subsequently addressed to his father in explanation of his intentions. I have spared you the pain of opposing my immovable resolve, and to evade your pursuit, my dear father, have entered the army of the Republic under an assumed name. Nor, till I have proved myself worthy to be classed among the most faithful of her sons, shall I revisit Corbeil. My last entreaty is that you give all your confidence to Bernardine, your true and diligent servant, and that you do not neglect the destitute family of Charlet the ferryman.
I knew it would be thus,
murmured the gentle Justine as she sauntered along the river walk of her father's garden, looking toward the Mill of Corbeil, when intelligence of young Clairvaux's departure transpired in the town.
I was sure he could not remain here, haunting the same spots and communicating with the same associates as before. He is right to fly. Felix has nothing more to do at Corbeil. His penance must be accomplished elsewhere. Miserable, miserable Felix! What thoughts, what recollections accompany him in his flight! What griefs, what terrors have been undermining his health! Yet Manette, who so dearly loved Valentine, has seen and suspected nothing of all this, while I so long, so hopelessly devoted to Felix, discerned his conscience-struck affliction from the first moment. I saw him gazing yonder from the shore on Charlet's hovel. The forest of Senart, the forest of Senart. Oh, that I could free myself from the imagination of that scene, that fatal, fatal night. No sooner am I left alone than involuntarily the whole black business arises before me. I fancy their encounter. I seem to hear their quarrel. I seem to see the struggle in which Valentine must have fallen a victim ere the dreadful idea presented itself to Felix of making him pass for a self-murderer. Appearances avouch the imputation. Appearances deceive the officers of justice, deceived his comrades, his master, his father, his friends, his affianced wife. But they did not deceive me, for it was not on Valentine's life, but on the well-doing of Felix Clairvaux that my happiness was pledged. And oh, how I have watched over his repentance, his despair. Had he triumphed in his wickedness, I should have learned to hate him, but to see him self-convicted, penitent, wretched, although thrice secure from discovery. Miserable, miserable Felix, driven from his home by the clinging curse of reminiscences, henceforward to be attached to his birthplace. Oh, when will he venture to return to Corbeil?
Meanwhile, the tumults of revolutionary violence were raging, and this question, at first universally reiterated in the little town, soon came to be repeated by old Cleriveau and Justine. The old man had already resigned the presidency of the mill to Bernardine the overseer, and the fine domain of Saint-Germain having become national property by the emigration of the noble family with whom it was hereditary, the chateau was readily appropriated by the Miller of Corbeil. Thither with a scanty household he retired, and there, uncared for and alone, falling gradually into a state of imbecility, it was a gratification to him, when tottering round the lawns whose beauty he was incapable of appreciating, to be accosted by the younger daughter of his neighbor Mathurin, with inquiries whether tidings had reached him from his son, and how it fared with the armies of France. But the old man's answer was ever the same. "The armies of France were triumphant, but no tidings from his son." Great names were beginning to arise from obscurity in the annals of the country. Lannes, Victor, Berendot, Murat, Durac, Berthet, Suchot, Soult. A great soldier had conquered to its banners the eagle-plumed ensign of victory, but no conjecture enabled Cleriveau to discover under what designation Felix had either fallen on the field of honor or was struggling onward in the career of fame. It was rumored in the town that once, when a brigade, on its march to join the army of the Seba and Meuse, halted at Essona, a superior officer was seen galloping back to the high road in the dusk of the evening from the portal of the church of Saint-Spire, where in the Tronc des Pauvres, adjoining the mausoleum of Count Harem of Corbeil, a bank bill of considerable amount was found on the succeeding morning. But none could say that the stranger was Felix Cleriveau, and if indeed he, the sons of Egypt and Italy, had written strange to feature in his face. At length, it was the triumphant epoch of the recognition of Le Soldat Heureux as first emperor of France. The Miller of Corbeil, long sickly and doting, was finally gathered to his rest, when a public advertisement having been legally circulated by the authorities of the department, and the sale of the property subsequently announced, the heir, the long absent, the half-forgotten Felix, appeared on the spot in the person of one of those eminent generals whose names had long been rife in the mouths of Corbeil, and their destinies commended to heaven by the prayers of their fellow countrymen. But when shortly afterwards the equipage of General Labree was seen entering the iron gates of the park of Saint-Germain, the notion of the presence of one of the heroes of Marengo, of the pyramids, of Austerlitz, seemed to have superseded all recollection of Felix Cleriveau. The villagers gazed on the noble person of the handsome, grave, and middle-aged soldier, whose head was more than slightly silvered by the toils of war, and saw no trace of the petulant youth they had been accustomed to watch 18 years before, crossing the river to La Tremblay, to laugh and jest with the roses of Corbeil. To his eyes, meanwhile, the season and the scene were very much the same as when he quitted them. He had become a hero, a statesman. Europe was familiar with his name, and his voice had obtained weight in the councils of France. His port was now erect and stately, his step firm and measured, his voice stern and commanding. He had learned to control the desires and passions of others. He had learned to control his own. Nothing in him but was altered. But there rolled the same blue Seine, there smiled the same vineyards, there stood the mill of Corbeil, there rose the woods of Saint-Germain, there the chimneys of the farm of La Tremblay, there, far below in the meadows, crumbled the ruins of a hovel, the hut of the ferryman, and there, in the distant horizon gloomed the forests of Sénart. And lo, unsilenceably resounded in his ears the mandate, "Thou shalt do no murder." It was some comfort to him to learn that Mathurin was no more, and the family of Charlet the ferryman dispersed and forgotten. "And the roses of Corbeil?" inquired General Labree. In a low voice, as accompanied by the gamekeeper of Saint-Germain, on the evening of his arrival, he pursued his way along the terrace, gazing through the gray evening twilight upon the open country. Matura's elder daughter, mon général, she who married a young farmer named Baptiste, is the mother of 10 fine children and still living at the Tremblay, said the garde du chasse. Her sister Justine, poor soul, has become a sister of charity. Hastily proceeding in their walk, the opening of the upper avenue of the chateau toward the vineyards brought them in sight of a fine, comely-looking countrywoman driving 2 cows and accompanied by a lout of a farming boy and 2 healthy little girls with untrimmed heads and dirty faces. Je ne vois justement mon Baptiste, ses enfants, continued the gamekeeper. Mon Baptiste. Hola, mon Baptiste. Voici monsieur le général, qui se forme de vous et votre famille. And General Lay found himself perforce required to stand and receive the awkward courtesies of the great fat countrywoman before him and listen to her history of her father's dying of an asthma and her own happy match with Baptiste the cowboy.
Brave garçon, c'est jamais une faute. Eh bien, aime douce pour Valentine. Monsieur le Général se rappelle sans doute c'est pour Valentine?
Alas, what else but the remembrance of Valentine had kept him so long an alien from his father's hearth, so long an exile from home? And it was for the woman before him that he had borne so much, incurred so much, sinned so greatly, so irreparably, poor feeble human nature, poor murdered Valentine. But the trial thus voluntarily encountered proved too much for Felix, and after remaining a few hours longer at Saint-Germain, General Lay quitted for the last time a spot abounding in soul-harrowing reminiscences rendering vain his toils of honor, his career of glory. For the brief remainder of his life, the fine mansion of Saint-Germain remained uninhabited, but the grave of General Lay is now at Ehrenbreitstein, his monument at the Pantheon, and his property having been bequeathed to the foundation of a military hospital otherwise invested. Strangers abide at the chateau, a company of speculators have assumed the direction of the Mill of Corbeil, and nothing remains to commemorate the past but the clear fountains of La Tremblay and a deserted grave in the churchyard in the village of Saint-Germain. A grave whose accusing voice will be heard by the guilty soul even through the fearful stillness of eternity. End of Section 1, recording by AllenO Impara.
Section number 2 of the Rover, Volume 1, number 3. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. The Rover, Volume 1, Number 3, edited by Seba Smith and Lawrence Labree. Section Number 2, Croix, A Tale of the Days of Terror. Monsieur Croix was a strange compound of the misanthrope and philanthropist, the miser and the fop, fermented by a strong leaven of the irritability and waywardness of insanity. And this man dwelt, 3 years ago, and probably still dwells, in the most profound seclusion, though in a fashionable street, in the gayest quarter of Paris, where thousands are thronging daily past his abode of misery, unconscious of the existence of such a being. The stamp of nobility was upon his lofty brow, and though age, or perhaps sorrow, had silvered his hair, it had neither bent his tall and finely proportioned figure, nor wrinkled the face which, in youth, must have been preeminently handsome. We became intimate. Our daily conversations between my window and his garden appeared not less agreeable to my neighbor than to myself. One great reason for the kindness he invariably manifested toward me, and the interest he took in my welfare, was, I verily believe, that in whatever society or place I met him, whether with a gay party in the Louvre, where it was his daily habit to walk in the winter, for the benefit of the fires which never gladdened his home, or in the crowded malls of the Tuileries and Boulevard, I invariably acknowledged the acquaintance of my venerable friend with a courteous salutation. After an acquaintance of several months, I was agreeably surprised by a request from the old man to visit him, an honor never anticipated, for not once in a year was a human being known to have been admitted into his mysterious dwelling. I was shown into a square, oak-floored room, with 2 windows looking toward the street, and 2 toward the garden. The shutters of the former were closed, and the cobwebs and dirt which had been accumulating for years upon the latter dimmed the bright light of the glorious sky without. There were faded portraits of his ancestors in flowing wigs and glittering breastplates hanging round the walls, which the recluse pointed out with manifest pride. But there was one object which excited my curiosity more than all the rest. Above the fireplace, supported by a broken fork on one side and a rusty nail on the other, hung a faded silk window curtain, and though in spite of all my hints, Monsieur St. Croix had forborne to raise it, I felt certain I could distinctly trace the outline of a large picture frame beneath. I had been struck by the agitated expression of his countenance when I alluded to this curtained department of the wall, and an opportunity afforded by the absence of my host was too tempting to be lost. I had lifted a corner of the silken veil, and had scarcely time to perceive beneath the portrait of a young and lovely female in the dress of a Carmelite nun, whose full dark eyes, as they met my gaze, beamed with more of tenderness than devotion, ere the returning footsteps of Monsieur St. Croix were audible in the passage. I dropped the curtain and saw it no more. I often discerned St. Croix afterward, as I returned home late from the Champs-Élysées or the Boulevard, seated at an open upper window upon a dirty striped pillow, reading in the moonlight, and our conversations from his garden were continued without interruption till my return to England. I know not wherefore, but the old man grew attached to me as to a child, and to my great surprise, the day before my departure, I saw him hastily crossing the court of our little hotel, and in another moment he entered, unannounced, into the salon where I sat. He held a scroll of papers in his hand, but, as usual, he was without a hat. "My young friend," he said, and he smiled, though tears were in his eyes, "you are about to depart, and with God's pleasure I shall not be long here. You have been kind to a poor, desolate old man, and I thank you. You have not mocked my infirmities like the rest of the world. You have been indulgent to them, though you know not their cause. It is time you should learn the dark events which made me what I am, a scorn and a laughing-stock to fools. You have spoken with a voice of kindness to my broken spirit. It was long since I had heard such tones from any human being, and they were very sweet. In your own land you will read these," he continued, giving me the roll of papers he held, and pressing both my hands convulsively between his as he did so. "You will learn there the fatal tale I have not power to relate, which, thank God, I sometimes forget. My mind is not what it was, but I have had cause for madness. I shall miss you much, but it will be a pleasure to me to think that you will pity me when you know all, and that though you are far away, you sometimes offer up your prayers for a solitary and forsaken being who hath great need of them." He then darted from my presence even more abruptly than he entered. It was the last time I beheld him. The following narrative is extracted from his roll of papers. Narrative of Monsieur St. Croix. "My father was one of the haute noblesse. It had been better for me if he had been a beggar. I should never then have been a slave to the leaden bondage of pride. Idleness would never have nourished the seeds of all the evil passions which, wretched victim, I inherited from a long line of corrupted ancestry. They would have had no time to bud and blossom in the hotbed of sloth. I should have been compelled to labor for my daily bread. Hunger would have tamed my wandering thoughts, and I might have been a happy and an honest man. My father and mother lived as many other French couples do at the present day, and many more did then. They dwelt under the same roof, met seldom, but with perfect politeness on both sides, hated each other with all their hearts, and spoke of each other, whenever such a rare occurrence did take place, with the tenderest affection. Sentiment covers a multitude of sins. They had 2 sons, an elder brother and myself, who were born in the first 2 years of their marriage, but since that time no prospect of a family had ever existed. Alphonse, the firstborn, was destined for a military life, war being considered the only admissible profession for the eldest son of a count et pair. I, who unluckily for myself came into the world a year later, was, even before my birth, condemned to the church. In fact, there was nothing else for me. The chief part of my father's income was derived from places under government, and that died with him. His estates were inextricably involved by the dissipations of his youth and the vanity of his old age, and at his death it would be incumbent on my brother to support his family dignity. For the young count to do this upon nothing was as much as could reasonably be expected, and my father prudently resolved to make the church provide for the rest of his progeny. He had more than one rich benefice in his eye, which he felt certain he had interest to procure, and I was scarcely released from swaddling clothes before I went by the name of the little Abbé. To all appearance at the time, this decision gave me many advantages, for while my brother was left for many years entirely to the care of servants, and at length transferred to that of an ignorant tutor, who took care that he should learn little but how to ride, dance, dress, and intrigue, I was duly instructed by a learned churchman in Greek, Latin, and theological science. But at the time I loathed such learning, and it has since proved but useless furniture to an overburdened brain. There never existed any affection between my brother and myself, and as we grew older, the coldness of our childhood deepened into actual hate. The study of divinity had not tamed my spirit. I was young, ardent, and full of hope, and the little I had seen and heard of the world made me think it Elysium. Perhaps the consciousness that I was condemned to forswear it lent it redoubled luster. I regarded Alphonse as the being who doomed me to be forever debarred from its pleasures. Was it wonderful then that I detested him, while the handsome person which I inherited from my mother made me the object of his envy and malevolence? Time wore away, but although I assumed the dress of the priesthood, and was subjected to all the discipline of the cloister, my heart was not in the calling. I incurred penances more than 12 times a month for irreverence of manner and absence without leave. I was condemned to fast on bread and water for 30 days, on conviction of the heinous offense of having written a love letter on the altar, and then thrown it, wrapped round a sou-piece, over a wall to a young lady in a garden adjoining the seminary. But all this severity did but drive the flame inward, to corrode my heart, and burst forth at a future period with renewed fury. It could not still the imagination, which flew forever from the page of learning and the empty ceremonies of religion, to luxuriate in a forbidden world. I was one with whom kindness might have done much, though tyranny nothing. But the reign of my oppressors was drawing fast to a close. It was a time when a spirit of liberality and enquiry on every subject was spreading rapidly abroad, and the old, afraid of the insubordination of the young, took the very way to drive them to rebellion. Opinions were no longer received upon trust, even in cloistered walls. Many like myself detested the whole system of hypocrisy, sloth, and superstition, of which we were made abettors, and my feelings had numerous participators amongst my young companions, who thought with me that the meanest toil in freedom would be preferable to the drudgery of fasting and prayer to which we were subjected. There was one older than ourselves in the convent, and better acquainted with what was passing in the world, who encouraged our awakened ardor for a change of things. He furnished us in secret with the forbidden works of Voltaire, Rousseau, and all whose daring spirits were gradually arousing our nation to shake off the chains of superstition and despotism under which they had lain benumbed for centuries. I was too young and too ardent to distinguish accurately what was false in these productions, but their eloquence fascinated my imagination, and I adopted every opinion as a truth which differed the most directly from all the dogmas I had been taught to believe. My own sacrifice to the shrine of my brother's greatness was, to me, sufficient argument in favor of equality, and by the time the States General were convened at Versailles, there could not have been found in all France a more violent advocate of the rights of the people than Auguste St. Croix. Many of the clergy, under the influence of Abbé Sieyès, and from a love of novelty, joined the Tiers-État, when that assumed the name of National Assembly. But their zeal for liberty was soon annihilated by the seizure of the church property and the suppression of all monastic establishments on the 13th February, 1790. It was not thus with myself. I felt like a slave whose chains had been miraculously struck off, or a corpse reawakened into life and bursting from the imprisonment of the grave. My father and brother had already fallen sacrifices to the fury of the ancient misused dependents of their house, while endeavoring to save their castle in Franche-Comté from plunder and destruction, and my mother, terrified by their fate, had escaped into Flanders. But my violent republican principles accorded well with the mania of the time, and though I could not recover my inheritance, I had no want of friends who supplied my daily necessities, until fortune should reward my exertions in the cause of liberty. I became a member of one of the most violent of the clubs, and intimate with several members of the National Assembly, and a constant attendant on its debates. But amidst all my political enthusiasm, my appetite for pleasure was undiminished, and at length I had none to check me in its indulgence, while thousands emulated me in the pursuit. Men in those days appeared in a continual delirium. Murder was no more to them than the phantom of a dream. Tumults and bloodshed were in the streets 1 hour, and dancing and revelry the next. Even females might be seen tripping smilingly with their gallants to the public walks, in the evening, over the sawdust sprinkled above the moist blood which had flowed from the morning's guillotine. It was like a time of pestilence, when men eagerly plunge into the wildest dissipation to forget the uncertainty of life. But no terror operated with me. I was young, fearless of death, and looked on the Revolution and its horrors as the noblest efforts of human wisdom and magnanimity. I loved pleasure for itself alone. It was a lovely summer evening toward the end of June when I set off with a party of friends in pursuit of this deluded deity to the little village of Onnières, situated below Montmartre on the opposite side of the river Seine. It was the village fete, and even the troubles of the times failed to interrupt these simple festivities of my countrymen. Never shall I forget that evening. Yet why should I say so? I have forgotten it 1,000 times, and would that I could forever. The sun was sinking bright and cloudlessly toward the western horizon as we crossed the broad fields of La Planchette from the Barrière Courcelle, and we lingered a while in our little boat on the Seine to watch its golden beams reflected in the stream and listen to the soft hum of festivities on its banks. It was the last time I ever experienced the consciousness of happiness. Dancing had already commenced when we reached the village green, and many happy groups were seated around the space left for the rustic performers, sharing their bottle of indifferent wine, and knocking their glasses together with jovial salutations. Black eyes without number were leveled at my companions and myself as soon as we pushed our way through the moving crowd, and they were not long in choosing partners for the dance. I was no lover of the pastime. Early education had made it awkward to me, and having no desire to exhibit before so large an audience, I sought amusement in the contemplation of the busy scene of happy faces around me. But my attention was soon absorbed by one object. Immediately opposite to me, and surrounded by a group of persons, who, though dressed with republican simplicity, were manifestly of the highest class, sat a young female of extraordinary beauty. She might be about 19. But why should I attempt to describe what no language nor limner's art could ever paint? Can it be that I survive to write thus of thee? Can it be that my mind can contemplate thy perfections without being lost in madness? Yes, she was perfection, and from the instant I beheld her on that village green, with the full light of the sinking sun irradiating her calm and gentle beauty, the conviction that she was so sunk deep in my heart. None but a madman could have doubted it for an instant. I was like one planet-stricken from the moment I beheld her. I could not remove my gaze. The crowd and their sports became alike invisible. Their sounds of mirth and the discord of their rustic music were equally inaudible to my ear. I saw only the lovely being before me. I heard only the magical sweetness of her voice when she occasionally addressed her companions. At length I thought she remarked my admiration, for when her eyes met mine for an instant, a deep color mounted to her temples, and she turned aside to speak to a gentleman near at hand. I would have given all I possessed at that moment to have been him whom she thus addressed and smiled upon, though he was old enough to have been my grandfather. The jokes of my friends on my abstraction at the end of the dance first aroused me from my trance, but it was not till another set was nearly formed that I remember the possibility of my obtaining the goddess of my idolatry as a partner. My hatred of dancing was instantly forgotten. I advanced toward the beautiful unknown with a palpitating heart, and in an agitated voice requested that honor. I was refused with the utmost politeness, but firmly and decidedly I was refused. There was nothing astonishing in this, for she had not danced during the evening with any, even of her own party, but I was offended, irritated, and annoyed. I was disappointed. In spite of my enthusiasm for liberty, the pride of my ancestry mounted in my heart, and I felt a haughty consciousness that if she had known who I was, I should not have been thus rejected, though I thought that my personal advantages might have accepted me from the insult. By a strange chance, I was at this instant recognized by a gentleman who had just joined the party, and in another moment I was formally introduced to Claudine and her father, Monsieur de Langeron, the sieur of the village. He had known the elder members of my family well and long, and on an invitation to spend the remainder of the evening at his chateau, whither he was just retiring with his party, was politely given and joyfully accepted. His daughter said little, but that was so soft and gentle as soon to dispel my displeasure, and her sweet smile was more expressive than words. Though dancing was renewed in the interior of the mansion, I observed she did not join in the amusement, nor did anyone present invite her to do so. I was selfish enough no longer to regret it. Seated by her side, for a time I had nothing more to desire. The moon had replaced the glowing sun when I recrossed the Seine that night. But though the calm splendor of heaven was unbroken by a single cloud, the tranquillity of my mind was gone. Thenceforward I became a daily visitor at Asnières, but no one seemed to regard or remark my attention to Claudine, though we were almost constantly together and frequently alone. She had no mother, and an old aunt, her only female companion, unlike most of her age and sex, seemed to entertain not the least suspicion of the consequence of our intercourse. She left us unmolested, to take long walks by the retired banks of the river, and to sit for hours on the terraced garden of the chateau. Such an intimacy added burning fuel to my passion, and as Claudine gradually lost her timidity in my presence, every day disclosed to me the additional charms of her unsullied mind. Though unaware of it herself, it was impossible for me to remain long unconscious that she loved me with all the intensity of a first affection. I never uttered a syllable that I did not meet her glance of approbation. I never departed that tears did not stand in her eyes, nor was met without blushes on my return. Every thought, feeling, hope, and fear of the unfortunate girl were mine forever. Selfish even in my love, I saw and exulted in all this before I disclosed the secret of my affection. We were seated on the margin of the river, nearly on the same spot where I landed on the first evening I beheld her, and the sun was shining in the western sky as brightly as then, when I whispered the story of my passion in her ear. Her hand trembled violently in mine as she listened, but in vain did I beseech her to reply to my passionate declamations. She gave no answer, but by tears. I entreated her by every tender appellation to give me some token of her love, but she neither moved nor spoke. She even ceased to weep. She did not withdraw her hand from mine, but it grew icy chill. Her head dropped upon her bosom, and she fell back, lifeless in my arms. I was horror-stricken, and it was some time before I recovered sufficient presence of mind to lay her gently on the grass, while I brought water from the neighboring river to bathe her hands and forehead. Slowly, and after a long interval, she revived, but no sooner was she conscious that my encircling arms were around her, than she shrunk from me with convulsive horror, and struggled to arise. She was too feeble to accomplish her purpose, and wildly and passionately I detained her, as I entreated her to disclose by what fatal chance I had become the object of her hatred. My hatred, dear Auguste? Would that you were, she murmured in almost inaudible accents, and then fixing her full dark eyes upon me for an instant, before she buried her face in her hands, she added in a voice tremulous from excess of emotion, "Is it possible you have yet to learn that I am a nun?" I started as these fearful words fell dull and cold upon my ear, but it was long before I made any reply. Early prejudices arose like phantoms before my sight. I remembered for the first time since our intercourse that I, too, was bound by a sacred vow to celibacy, and for a time I beheld in these trammels of bigotry the fiat of interminable misfortune. But vows, whether sacred or profane, are feeble against the tempest of passion, and when the mind is once resigned to its despotic influence, principles and prejudices are equally swept away by the whirlwind. I did not long yield to despair. The new doctrines I had adopted, in casting aside my priest's frock, though for a moment forgotten in the turbulence of exciting feeling, soon came to my assistance. According to these, Claudine and I were as free as at the moment of our birth to follow the guidance of the feelings which nature had implanted in our hearts, and I endeavored to convince the innocent girl, with all the fervor and eloquence of which I was master, that she was no longer the bride of heaven, and that her vows had ceased to be binding when formally annulled by the National Assembly. The next day I returned again to the charge, and though she remained unconvinced, my vehemence silenced all opposition. I saw that she wavered between a sense of duty and the passionate feelings of her heart, and I redoubled the earnestness of my supplications. I painted wildly the horror and despair which awaited us, should she persist in her resolve, and doom us to an eternal separation, while I described with all the enthusiasm which the joyful hope inspired, the felicity attending our union. Gentle being, it was no sin of thine that thou didst yield to the burning words and delirious eloquence with which I tempted thee to thy ruin. Mine only was the guilt, and mine alone be the never-ending punishment. That night she slept not beneath her father's roof. Trembling and breathless with agitation, I drew her towards the bank of the river, and though even at the last she struggled faintly to return, I heeded it not, and lifting her on board the little bark which had borne me from the opposite shore, I dipped my oars in the stream and rowed rapidly with the current towards Saint-Denis. We reached Paris before sunset, and to tranquilize the conscience of poor Claudine, as much as in my power, we were united before nightfall, by such ceremonies as the National Assembly had thought proper to substitute for the ancient marriage rites. My passion thus gratified, I could for a time at least have been perfectly happy, but that I saw that Claudine was not so. She had acted under the influence of my overwhelming feelings, not her own, and her reason was never for a moment silenced. Though she complained not, she drooped under the sense of the mighty weight of guilt she had incurred. The bloom faded from her cheek, and the roundness of her form gradually wasted away. The state of the times, and the interest which my necessities compelled me to take in public affairs, caused me to be frequently absent from home. On my return, I invariably found her in tears. She shrunk from all society but mine, she refused to join in every amusement, and each day deepened a gloom which all my efforts were unable to dispel. It was about this period that a young priest, of the name of Bernie, who had formerly studied in the same seminary with myself, claimed my protection from the persecution instituted against all his profession who refused to take the oaths prescribed by the assembly. Before my change of principles, there had been a great intimacy between us, and I still liked the man, whom I thought kind-hearted and generous, though I disapproved his doctrine. I did not hesitate, therefore, when his life was in danger, to afford him a retreat even in my own house, where, from my own well-known Republican principles, he esteemed himself in perfect security. Domesticated under the same roof, he was, of course, much in my wife's society. With horror be it spoken, I grew jealous of that man. I frequently surprised him in close and earnest conversation with Claudine. I saw that she regarded his slightest wish with deference, while I could not help imagining that her manner toward me became gradually more cold and estranged. There was evidently a violent struggle at work in her breast. Her cheek by day burnt with a hectic of fever, and at night, amid her troubled and broken sleep, long sighs frequently heaved from her bosom, and I more than once heard her murmur, in fearful accents, the names of Bernie and myself. Suspicion once aroused in my headstrong nature, it soon assumed the energy of truth, and at length, after a night little short of the tortures of the damned, I arose, resolved to expel the priest from the shelter of my roof. As if to justify my worst imaginings, he was already gone, and Claudine had likewise disappeared. Then did the fatal malady, which for successive generations had asserted its black dominion over my race, first take possession of my brain. I swore, I blasphemed, I denounced the bitterest curses against the guilty pair. Had boiling lead been coursing through my veins, it could not have surpassed my agony. But there was a method in my madness. When the first burst of my fury passed away, I began sedulously to seek out the abode of the fugitives. Step by step I traced them, as the bloodhound follows his prey. But when I learned the secret of their hiding place, I was satisfied. I did not intrude myself on their privacy, for reproaches and upbraiding would have afforded no relief to my overburdened soul. No, I had a deeper, a darker, a more satisfying revenge in store. Coldly and calmly as a sleepwalker, but with fiend-like pleasure, I went and denounced Claudine and her seducer to the revolutionary tribunal as aristocrats and nonconformists. Yes, I delivered my innocent, my confiding, my adoring Claudine to the blood-thirsty vengeance of those inhuman vampires, and exulted in the deed. I have an indistinct remembrance of lingering in the street till the minions of the law bore her forth in their arms to the carriage which was to convey her, with the unfortunate Bernie, to the prison of the abbey, and of struggling vainly to rescue her from their grasp. But it is like the confusion of a dream. The first circumstance which I clearly recollect, after a fearful chasm of many days, was the receipt of a letter, the direction of which, though written with a trembling hand, I instantly recognized as my wife's writing. And eager to snatch at anything which might prove the fallacy of the thoughts fast thronging on my brain, I tore it wildly open. It was dated from the prison to which I had doomed her. But though 30 years have rolled their dark current above my head since that hour, though every word has been since then like the sting of a serpent to my brain, I would, even now, rather die than transcribe it. It convinced me of her innocence and her love. I gathered from its details that the reproaches of Bernie had deepened her repentance of our unholy union, till at length, guided by his advice, she had sacrificed the best affections of her heart at the shrine of imaginary duty, and torn herself from the only being she loved to expiate the guilt of that affection in the seclusion of a foreign convent. Poor victim, she prayed him who had sacrificed her peace and her life to his diabolical passions to use his influence to procure the liberation of herself and her holy director from their fearful prison. Let me briefly pass over the narrative of the day. I started up, flew to the tribunal of the commune, attested the innocence of the accused, and my intimacy with the chiefs of the Democrats sufficed to make my word a law, and procured for me without delay a warrant for the liberation of Claudine and the priest. I hurried with breathless speed along the street toward their prison, but crowds at every turning impeded my progress. Murder was already abroad in the city. It was the 2nd of September, 1792, that day which has fixed forever one of the blackest stains in the history of my country. As I passed the prisons of the Châtelet and La Force, I heard the groans and supplications of the dying, mingling fearfully with the demoniac yells of an infuriated mob. Women's screams arose wildly on the air, and blood came flowing past me down the channels of the streets. Everything betokened that the prisons were burst open, and their unfortunate inhabitants massacred by inhuman ruffians. Dark and fearful were the forebodings which thronged upon my mind, as on approaching the abbey, the same sounds of tumult and murder burst upon my ear. I hurried on, in spite of every obstacle, with the velocity which only madness could have lent me, till I reached the front of the building, and there such a scene presented itself as my soul sickens to think on. The armed multitude of men and women of the lowest class resembled in their fury rather fiends than human beings, but I heeded them not. I sprung over the dying and the dead. I escaped from the grasp of the assassin, for there was yet hope that I might not be too late. And though I recognized the mangled body of Bernie amid a heap of slain, I relaxed nothing of my speed, for my wife, my adored Claudine, might yet survive his destruction. My suspense was soon at an end. Yes, I saw her, and yet I survived the sight. I saw her at a little distance. She was kneeling with clasped hands at the feet of an infuriated ruffian, whose weapon was already at her breast. At that moment she recognized my cry of agony, sprang wildly on her feet, and called with an imploring voice upon my name. It was the last word she uttered. The steel struck her ere she could escape into my arms. It struck deeply and fatally, yet well for her. But for me. End of section 2.
Section 3 of the Rover, Volume 1, Number 3. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Kate Follis. The Rover, Volume 1, Number 3. Edited by Seba Smith and Lawrence Labree. Section 3. The Banknote, or Woman's Love and Man's Repentance. It was midnight. Disease and health, virtue and crime, famine and the epicure were now gone hand in hand together, and for a few short hours thoughts and imaginations, as varied as their names, were sunk in sleep, while the wildest of fashion's children, the creatures of dissipation and hereditary folly, with the panderers to unhallowed and unlawful passions, and all the other numerous forms of destitution and depravity that, phantom-like, haunt the midnight air of London, were busy deepening the gulf into which poor humanity had already fallen. From one of the largest houses in Square, upon the evening just described, sounds of music, mirth, and revelry were plainly distinguished, and despite the lateness of the hour or its disagreeableness, numerous carriages with their attendants were waiting around its portals, while a little old man, called by a singular contrariety the Link Boy, who for several hours had, in company with his pitchy compilation, been alternately dashing himself into the road and beneath the horses' girths, under the idea that he was lighting the company, was now amusing the lackeys with some eccentric reminiscence of his equally eccentric life. Lady Herndon was the name of the proprietress of the establishment to which we have introduced the reader, and despite the coldness of the season and the various essences with which the place was perfumed, the vast suite of apartments were crowded to an extent that rendered a position near the window far from disagreeable. Half withdrawing the curtains and gazing upon the cheerless scene without, a young and fashionably dressed man remarked to another who was standing near him that the last gallop had completely disabled him, and the cold night air was quite refreshing. "I could not feel the heat of these apartments, Sir Henry," was the reply, "for I have been too busy gazing elsewhere." "And where may that have been?" inquired his companion carelessly. "An object that could rivet the attention of one so discriminating as Vivian Delorme must indeed be worthy of another's observation." "You flatter, Sir Henry," replied the other, "but I was thinking Matilda Saville will be a very pretty woman." As the young man spoke, he pointed out to his companion among the group of beauties one who, from her dress and general contour, preeminently shone. "Will be a pretty woman!" exclaimed the young baronet, with considerable animation in his manner. "By heaven, she is one already! Who is she? What is she? And where does she come from?" "She is the daughter of a half-pay officer, and comes from the region of the shuttle and the loom, Manchester." "Indeed," said Sir Henry. "Well, I imagined she must be a stranger, as I had not seen her before. But really this is quite romantic. Let me see, poor and pretty, a stranger, and the daughter of a half-pay officer, the last the very ne plus ultra of a romancist." "Add to this," interrupted Delorme, "that she is seen by a young baronet, who loves her to distraction upon first meeting her in a ballroom." The words were uttered in a half-laughing tone, but they were not responded to by his companion, and he continued, "But we are wrong. She is not quite so poor as she is beautiful, having great expectations from her aunt, that magnificent-looking woman yonder, who is almost as tall as yourself." "That!" exclaimed Sir Henry. "That! Why, surely that is Lady Fetherfield, the widow of a distant relation of mine." "True, her husband was an Irish peer, and was killed at a steeplechase. Did you know him?" "I but slightly recollect him, for I was but a child when he met his death. But I will accost his grand-looking relict, and make her introduce me to her lovely niece." As he uttered these words, Sir Henry Cathcart, for such was the name of the last speaker, stepped gracefully forward to a chair, where reclined the person of a lady apparently about 50, adorned in a style of profuse magnificence, harmonizing with her portly and massive figure. The dialogue which we have just been narrating took place between two individuals as opposite in their characters as they were in personal appearance. Vivian Delorme was a young man of French extraction, about 22 years of age, with a cast of countenance decidedly foreign, joined to a person of diminutive stature. He had for a considerable period been the most intimate friend of Sir Henry, and although a man of a very confined intellect, yet nevertheless was endured with that spurious sort of understanding denominated cunning, which is frequently found to be more use in an abstract sense to the possessor than those stores of original ability and erudition that are so rarely to be encountered in this everyday world. Sir Henry Cathcart was his junior, having just attained his majority, and by the death of both his parents at a much earlier age, was now the sole inheritor of a handsome fortune and estate. His figure offered a strange contrast to that of his companion, being tall, majestic, and commanding, while his character was frank, open, and generous. In short, he was what the world would term a fine-looking young man, possessing all the appearance of an aristocratic descent, possessing all that absence of hauteur so peculiarly the attribute of the true gentleman. Lady Featherfield, the lady to whom he was now advancing, must certainly have once been beautiful, if beauty is ever consonant with a style of face which presents us features upon which we can dwell with pleasure, but no expression upon which the imagination can hang with rapture, resembling in a remarkable degree some splendid structure, wherein fashion is wont to dwell, and which we acknowledge to be well formed and accurately designed, but notwithstanding all its ornamental pillars and decorative balconies, insufficient to attract more than a mere passing and unadmiring gaze. "I would not ask my friend Delorme," commenced the young baronet, "I would not ask him to present me to your ladyship, for when I mention my name I flatter myself you will not consider me in the light of a stranger. Henry Cathcart." The eyes of the gorgeous widow were turned for an instant upon the fine intellectual countenance of the speaker, as if reflecting where they had before met. Suddenly she appeared to recollect the features, and exclaimed, "Ah, Sir Henry, I'm delighted to see you. Why, what a height you've grown to! It is nearly 6 years I've seen you, that really I had nigh forgotten you. Dear me, what an alteration a few years does make at your age." There was a decidedly emphasis on your, and smiling complacently as she bethought herself on the comeliness of her own person, awaited his reply. "Pray, Lady Featherfield," said Sir Henry abruptly, impatient of farther delay, "did I hear aright that that beautiful young creature yonder is your niece?" "Yes, that is my sister's child. She is rather pretty, certainly. Not my style of beauty, though, but she still is attractive among some men." As she spoke, she beckoned the object of Sir Henry's inquiries toward her, and taking her hand, said, "This is Sir Henry Cathcart, my dear, who has been pleased to pass some very flattering encomiums upon you, and of whose approbation you ought to be proud, for I hear that he is a connoisseur. Do you admire tall or little women most, Sir Henry?" added or interrogated the Baroness, parenthetically to Cathcart. "I admire both," was the gallant and ready answer, for her ladyship was full 5'9", and Matilda scarcely above the ordinary size of her sex, a size which, en passant, in the present day appears degenerating into Lilliputianism. "But which most?" retorted her ladyship, "for all men have their tastes." "Upon my honour, Lady Featherfield, wherever beauty is, I gaze and admire without thinking on its peculiar merits or order, if I may use an architectural term," replied Cathcart. "Who could say that St. Paul's is not equal to Westminster Abbey? Indeed, I acknowledge it to be the grandest, but I prefer the latter individually," thus dexterously obviating the necessity of offending the aunt, and delicately insinuating his intense admiration of the niece. As a more than adequate counterpoise, Sir Henry applied himself to the pleasing task of eliciting the mental powers of Matilda Saville. by a not affected display of his own accomplishments and sentiments. He found her intelligent, amiable, and confiding, but slightly imbued with a taste for the romantic and sentimental. Sir Henry Cathcart was decidedly a young man of superior mind, if not of very surpassing abilities, and moreover united to a person of eminent elegance a peculiar faculty of pleasing. The growth of love is not to be estimated by any standard with which we are acquainted, and we would fain add that our hero was deserving of the confidence and admiration which he seldom failed to excite, that morally as well as mentally he was a person to be respected. But, alas, the elements of virtue are not to be attained, or if to be attained, at least it is an exception of a general rule, among those with whom he was in the habit of mingling, men not undistinguished in the ranks of fashion and even intellect, but for the most part votaries of dissipation, vice, and irreligion. Cathcart continued to speak, and Matilda hung enraptured upon the words that fell from his lips, full as they were of fancy, of refinement, and of elegant, if not poetical, sentiment, and in the course of a single hour experienced in her romantic views more pleasure than ever she had before. Sir Henry had travelled much. Although so young, he had beheld the gorgeous remains of Rome's once imperial grandeur, had climbed the snow-capped Alps, and rioted in the fair valley below. Ocean and river, hill, cataract, and lake were all subjects on which he could expatiate with all the charms of a lively feeling, and its effect was not lost upon a mind like Matilda's. We do not say she immediately became enamored of the handsome and clever young baronet, but he knew enough of her sense to feel that his company was not indifferent to her, and as he rose to leave, he pressed her to remember their first meeting, and to grant him on a future occasion the honour of a second. "Well," inquired Delorme, "what do you think of her?" as Matilda with her aunt left the room. "She is a beautiful girl," replied his companion, "quite a heroine in her language, rather too romantic, but that will wear off." The Frenchman smiled, and to his companion's inquiry answered with something of a sneer in his tone, "I was thinking how strange these things come about. Nobody would have thought when we entered this house there was the remotest chance of your getting a wife so soon, though young Mathilde Cathcart would sound pretty enough, and how much nearer the relationship would be between you and the noble-looking Baroness." "You are jesting, Vivian," said Sir Henry. "I fear that cannot be, for I have lost heavily, as you know, of late, and much as I respect, nay, love, Matilda Saville, I could not afford to take her portionless. Besides, I don't think I shall ever marry at all. The devil! What is your reason for setting up all the Benedict?" "Wives are generally bores," was the laconic reply. "At least so they say at the club." The finish of the sentence bespoke how much he was guided by the mistaken laws of fashion. 3 months after the above conversation, the London season being over, Lady Featherfield and her niece left town for a distant part of the country. It was reported that ill health led her to choose such a retired spot, though there were others in which her creditors' claims bore a prominent position. By a singular coincidence, a few days afterward, Sir Henry Cathcart, who had a hunting seat in that very part of the country, for the first time in his life, took a fancy to visit it, and with surprise learned who were his neighbours. The Baroness was delighted. Her old London acquaintance to be so near them, it was extraordinary, it was charming. Cathcart now had numerous opportunities of meeting with Matilda alone. The romantic feeling, which he had noticed in London, was here tenfold increased, and often would he find her by the side of some pleasant stream, attended by a favourite dog, and lost in the pages of some fashionable author, unconscious of his approach till he had reached her side. It was upon such occasions as these that he wound himself around her young heart, until at length she loitered but for his coming, and the views that once pleased her were dull and spiritless without him. Lady Featherfield heard of these repeated meetings, and only prolonged the moment of her interference, that she might, as she afterwards stated, the more surely secure her niece as his bride. Nor was she awakened to a sense of her improper supineness till she learned her niece had eloped with the young baronet. The particulars of their criminality, the arguments by which Sir Henry prevailed upon Matilda to forego virtue's name, we must pass over. Suffice it, she had fallen, and as her lover lifted her from the carriage door the morning after the elopement, he exclaimed, "Now am I blessed in the memory of our first meeting." It was on a gorgeous summer's evening, several years after the above events, just as the day god was sinking below the horizon and crimsoning with his latest lustre the western sky, that a pale but still beautiful woman, of about 25 years of age, was reclining upon a sofa in a neat but elegantly furnished boudoir, from the windows of which was a full prospect of Hyde Park. As its occupant gazed upon the scene, her large blue eye dilated for a moment, and then a tear filled up its place, accompanied with sobs, rendered doubly painful from the agonizing but fruitless attempt to suppress them. "Alas!" she murmured unconsciously, "in a little while I will have quitted this weary scene for ever. In a little while Matilda Saville will exist but in name, and that, alas, will be one that conscience conjures up as too odious to give utterance to." There is nothing, perhaps, can present a more melancholy spectacle to the eye of fallen man than the picture of a young and beauteous creature, ere the heyday of life is past, lying stricken with a painful and lingering disease. Matilda Savage, for she it was who now occupied the little chamber, was in the last fatal grasp of a consumption. A hectic flush occasionally overspread her thin, transparent skin, and her eyes became preternaturally bright. But it was the disease of the mind that thus oppressed her, and its agonizing gloom that overshadowed her soul, and nullified the usual and often efficacious attentions of the leech. It was after a reverie of more than usually intense mental suffering that she gave utterance to the language above described, and then she again relapsed into a train of thought so acute that though her features bore more the impress of somnolency than life, the cold drops of perspiration that chased each other down her brow bespoke how deep a wound conscience's dart was making. "I will bear it no longer," she exclaimed, springing with the excitement of the maniac from her little couch. This shall decide it." With the same wild, unnatural effort, she crossed the room and reached down a small mahogany case. It was locked, but in a moment the poker had shattered in the lid. The exertion, however, was too much for her, and ere she could make herself mistress of its contents, she had swooned upon the ground. Scarcely had the poor misguided victim of seduction and disease fallen from the effects of her exertion, ere the little door of the boudoir was thrown violently open, and a young man, his hair dishevelled, his neckcloth loose and disordered, and his whole countenance inflamed, either from drink or the most violent excitement, entered the apartment, followed by one who from his dress was evidently a servant. "Away, sir, to your duty!" exclaimed Sir Henry Cathcart, for he it was who had suddenly entered the chamber. "The villain dies! Where is the key of my pistol case? Where is—" The words froze upon his lips, and the excitement of a madman and a would-be murderer were changed instantaneously to the wild, vacant gaze of unutterable despair. For a moment, and a moment only, every nerve seemed paralyzed. Then, with one long, loud shriek or cry, he pointed to the fallen form of his mistress, and exclaimed, in a tone of excruciating bitterness, "Scoundrel! This is thy work! Did I not charge thee not to leave her, even for an instant? And now she is dead, and her own hand has robbed me of the only charm that could now render life supportable. Honour, fortune, friends, wife, all gone. What has Cathcart now to live for?" A few hours after the above, in another chamber lay Matilda Saville, her hand clasped in that of her lover. "I have lost all," exclaimed Sir Henry. "The dice were loaded. The villain, Delorme, and another had been playing with me for 6 hours when I made the discovery. Maddened by my losses, I hastened from the house, and despite my dress and the surprise of the passers-by, made for your boudoir, where I knew my pistols were, intending to seek summary justice upon the villain. You know the rest. My horror at finding you, as I thought, forever taken from me, and my joy at having you again restored." Matilda arose, and with difficulty placed her emaciated but still lovely hands upon the hot brow of her seducer. "Harry," she exclaimed, "promise me faithfully that you will never again touch those fatal dice. Say you will never game again." "What have I to game with now, even had I the will?" he exclaimed. "Lost, ruined, a beggar, and by one to whom I have been more than brother, the villain Delorme. I am a beggar. Yes, Matilda, a wretched beggar." "Not so," answered Matilda. "You gave me once, in happier days, ere I was the wretched being that I now am, a note for £1,000. It was to buy jewels for my wedding day. That day will never come. I have never spent it. It is here. Take it, Harry. I shall die soon, and I shall die happy in the consolation that it will assist you. Take it, Harry, and God bless you with it." As the deeply injured girl spoke, she produced from her bosom a bank-note, and presenting it to her lover, continued, "There, Harry, it is warm from a heart that has ever loved you, but will soon cease to beat. I have always worn it there, knowing your gay life. I thought the day might come when it would be of service." Then, throwing her arms around his neck, she wept. "No, no," gasped Sir Henry. "No, Matilda, you must not die. There are brighter days in store for us yet. Dearest, we will be happy again, though I have deceived you." As he spoke, the tear of true repentance stole down his cheek with a gush of old and warm affection, and he added, "No, Matilda, no. I have nothing now but you." Looking in his face, with a gaze that told how true she spoke, she replied, "Do not attempt to deceive me. It is useless. I am certain that I shall not survive many days, perhaps hours, but I would ask one last request. Renounce your present life. There are but 2 paths that led to happiness, virtue and the grave. If our feet have strayed from one, perchance our souls may gain the other." Matilda sank down exhausted. "What a villain I have been!" exclaimed Sir Henry, as he gazed upon the form of his dying mistress, and recalled her image as he had first beheld it, in placid innocence. His feelings were those of mingled agony and remorse. He had loved Matilda as well as he could love anything on earth, and her solemn and pathetic appeal had awakened thoughts his heart had always before been a stranger to. He felt that he had seduced and afterward neglected her, but her gentle tenderness and amiability of character, her patient and unrepining endurance, and her last proof of unceasing love, in providing against distress for one who had so basely deceived her, and afterward by his excesses brought poverty to her dying bed, was something more than human. It was a warmth that even friendship, strongest of man's ties, was too cold to reach. It was worthy of its name. It was woman's love. "You shall not die, Matilda," exclaimed Sir Henry. "Much injured woman, the church shall first unite us. Live to call me husband as in thy heart I feel I have ever been." With a power almost supernatural, Matilda raised herself from the bed, and grasping his hand, exclaimed with a faint smile, "My husband." There was a pause of a moment. It was a fearful struggle. The tongue refused its office. The eyeball sank, and she breathed rather than spoke. "Repent." The next moment Sir Henry Cathcart's arms supported dust. "It was my wife's first, her last request," he exclaimed. Reader, he faithfully obeyed it. End of section 3.
Section 4 of the Rover, Volume 1, Number 3. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. The Rover, Volume 1, Number 3, edited by Seba Smith and Lawrence Labree. Section 4. The Jewel of the Harem, by Lawrence Labree. Nur Mahal was the most beautiful of all the slaves in the seraglio of the Sultan Ben Youssef. The soft and voluptuous luster of her large black eyes, the delicate tint of her beautiful cheek, and the ravishing sweetness of her pouting lips, parting at times to betray teeth that rivaled the whiteness of new-fallen snow. Real pearls of Omar were so many tokens that the possessor was of Georgian extraction, one of the many victims that in a late successful invasion of her unhappy country by the Sultan and his troops had been added to the harems of the Persian nobles and of their ambitious and tyrannical monarch. Of all the unfortunate captives of the illustrious Sultan, none stood so high in his especial regard as the lovely Nur Mahal, and for her his love and esteem seemed boundless, so much so that it was suspected that a day was not far distant when the fair Georgian would share the throne of the magnificent Khosrou Shawan Ben Youssef. With much condescension, kindness, and lenity did he treat his beautiful captive, but to no effect. She remained firm and unswerving. She often repulsed him with much severity, upbraiding him as the oppressor of her country and the merciless jailer of herself and her unfortunate companions. Among the nobles of the court of Ben Youssef was Callimachus, a brave and generous prince of the Seleucidi, a renowned and chivalrous warrior and a zealous supporter of the Sultan, though opposed to many of his harsh and tyrannical measures. To him, then, did the Sultan communicate his ill success with the lovely Nur Mahal. He pictured to him in glowing terms the ardour of his passion for the beautiful captive, of the many and unsuccessful attempts to ingratiate himself in her favour, and of her continued obstinacy. "I have tempted her love," said the Sultan, "with costly and magnificent presents, and by flattery. Still she resists me, and the only reply she makes is, 'Restore me to my friends and my country, and I will bless you, I will pray you.'" And does the Qibla Alam suspect no hitherto untried method of subduing the obstinacy of this bright jewel of the seraglio? Inquired Callimachus. "Alas, my Callimachus, none. I have exhausted all my efforts to please, and my endeavours to win to no purpose. Like the Houris of paradise, she seems rather to be dreamed of than possessed. Favoured of the Prophet, do the honours which you bestow as freely as falls the dew seem of no value in the eyes of the lovely Nur Mahal? Even so, yet deserving as thou art, O king, perseverance in thy desires may at length bring thee that love which thou seekest. Recollect that the illustrious Timur, when once hard pressed by his enemies, took shelter in a ruinous building, where for many a tedious hour he was obliged to sit alone, ere an opportunity was offered him to escape. While thus situated, his attention was arrested by the efforts of an ant to carry a grain of corn up a wall of great height, during which time it fell to the earth 69 times. But at the 70th time it was successful. From this, that great monarch and illustrious warrior received a useful lesson, by which many times in after life he profited much. I acknowledge, my Callimachus, the force of the application, but then Timur warred with men. Had he or the ant had to do with the petulancy of woman, their perseverance would have failed them. However, I have another method in my brain, which I think will prove successful. I will put my cause into thy hands, that you may plead before this proud Georgian, as I would plead for myself. If you succeed according to my fondest hopes, I will requite the obligation by making thee my vizier, and the brightest jewel in my diadem shall glitter in thy turban. Be true, be faithful, and my liberality shall know no bounds. But if thou art false, by the beard of the Prophet, my vengeance shall be terrible. God is great, and Mahomet is his prophet. Even as the king of the faithful wishes it, so shall it be done, replied Callimachus. The slave shall be removed to an apartment in the palace, where you can visit her, and I hope soon to hear that you have succeeded according to my wishes. The Sultan quitted the apartment, leaving Callimachus to ponder upon the strange trust confided to his care. The 5th morning after the above incident dawned beautifully and brightly. The beams of the rising sun gilded the lofty turrets and minarets of Shiraz, and cast a gleam of cheerfulness upon the countenances of the numerous throngs of Moslems that crowded its streets, some on their way to the baths, some to the mosques, others to the bazaars, and many for pleasure. The sweet bowers of Masala and the 3 rose gardens of the princes sent to heaven a sweet and grateful fragrance. But among all the brightness and joyousness of the morning, there was one face shrouded in gloom. The pensive tear stood in her upraised eye, her fair cheek rested upon her hand, and her lips were parted as though in silent prayer. It was the beautiful, the unfortunate Nur Mahal. Although removed to a more commodious and magnificent apartment than was first allotted her, with a door that opened upon a garden. Still the splendor and garish magnificence which surrounded her illy accorded with the feelings of the poor captive. She thought of her own dear home, of her parents, her sisters, her brothers, and her grief was too deep for utterance. Thoughtfully and silently she mourned, for what did she value life, cut off from all that she held dear, a captive and annoyed daily with a wooer whom she abhorred. Thus sat she in silent misery, when her ears caught the sound of steps approaching her apartment. Her heart trembled within her as she thought of the Sultan and his oppressive importunities. She feared that he would not much longer mildly bear with her abhorrence of him. She saw no gleam of hope, she felt none. She dreaded the hour when his patience must tire and his temper fail. The door was opened, and a mild and kind voice addressed her as the most beautiful. It thrilled through her every nerve. She dared not look up, but she could not be mistaken. It must be. It was the voice of the noble Callimachus. As he advanced toward her, she arose to receive him. His admiring gaze rested upon the fair being before him, and he thought that never, in his brightest and happiest dreams of fancy, had he seen aught so lovely. For a while he seemed so wrapped in wonder that he forgot by whose request and for what purpose he was sent. "Most lovely, though most unfortunate," began Callimachus, "the most illustrious of the faithful, the Sultan Ben Yusef commissioned me, his devoted slave, to wait upon the royal beauty of the Seraglio, to lay before her his distressed condition, and to beg the humanity of thy gracious favour to soothe the wound of his much discomfited heart." "Return then to him thou callest thy master," said Nur Mahal, "and tell him that as I am deprived of my liberty, my parents, my country, and my friends, life to me is as valueless as my freedom is unexpected. There is only one way to win my esteem, none to win my love. I defy him. He may torture me, he can invent no torture greater than my confinement. Death to me were indeed liberty, come in what shape it may. Tell him this, and likewise that it is my wish he persecute me no longer. I will hold out no hope to him, there is none, and it were a waste of breath, of time, of words, to pursue this useless fallacy. Alas, sweet flower of Georgia, hast thou considered well the firmness of thy purpose to return such an answer to the Sultan?" "So well," replied Nur Mahal, "that I had determined to tell it to his face, had he presented himself instead of thee. Unfortunate Nur Mahal, pained as I am to afflict thy maiden heart, the wishes and behests of my sovereign must be reverenced. Yet I could wish thee a better and a happier lot, as the circumstances which surround thee cannot be avoided. I would advise thee to reconsider the wishes of his heart, and if thou canst incline toward his will. It is in vain, and your advice falls unheeded. Either leave me, or cease to persecute me with the Sultan's importunities." Admiration of the spirited girl for a moment held Callimachus mute, and a strange and heretofore unknown feeling trembled in his breast. At first he scarce knew what report to make to the Sultan, but he finally resolved that when he returned he would flatter him with hopes of his ultimate success, thereby securing the opportunity of often seeing her. He therefore kindly took his leave of her, expressing a hope that he might see her again, and recommending her to think carefully upon what he had said to her. The Sultan, eager to learn the success of Callimachus, impatiently awaited his return in his private apartment. As he entered, Ben Yusef rose to meet him. Now, my Callimachus, how speeds the wooing? What success? How seems she? Would she listen to you? By the beard of the prophet, had you but seen her yesterday, I thought she would smite me. Your serene majesty will be pleased to hear that she is more inclined to reason today, yet she is possessed of great stubbornness, which will require several days to overcome. But I will venture to say you may give some small encouragement to your hopes. 'Tis very well, and Callimachus begin to hope for the viziership. Go on as thou hast begun, and if thou art successful, there shall be no bounds to my liberality. Thy slave is ever ready at thy bidding. Thou mayest command. 'Tis good. Thou mayest now retire, but recollect tomorrow, my Callimachus. Callimachus, bowing to the command of his sovereign, turned to depart, and had reached the door, when the stern voice of the Sultan recalled him. Look you, Callimachus, see that you do not play me false, or by Allah, and he furiously stamped his foot upon the marble floor. Am I ignorant of the consequences, or dost thou think me a fool? Replied Callimachus. Thou art right. Callimachus is not a fool. Farewell. The aspiring and ambitious noble departed. His mind was filled with contesting emotions. He had dared to look upon the queen of the Seraglio, his sultan's favourite, with the eyes of love. He had allowed himself to drink deep of the intoxicating passion, to feast his heart on the beauties of her person and the nobleness of her mind. Alas, he had already wandered far from the path of duty to his sovereign. He felt that he was getting into a labyrinth of difficulties, from which it would be hard to extricate himself. Yet, like a charmed bird, he gradually closed upon the danger which he could scarcely expect would end otherwise than fatal to himself. The next day, and the next, and the next, found Callimachus a visitor of the lovely Nourmahal. He had forgotten, or seemed to, the interests of the Sultan, and for himself alone, did he now plead, not at first with the outpourings of his passion, for that would have shocked the captive's ear, but with the silent pleading of his eyes, the kind and sympathizing manner of his conversation, endeavouring to lead her mind from the reflection of her unfortunate captivity, conversing with her of her own dear country, till, by degrees imperceptible to herself, he won her friendship and esteem, and at last she began to wait with impatience for his daily visits. In the meantime did he report himself to his sovereign, as rapidly progressing in his suit, and hoping shortly to remove all difficulties. For a week did he visit Nourmahal in this manner, and the Sultan began to grow impatient. Callimachus had not yet spoken of love, but now that things were drawing to a climax, now that the secret could not be hidden much longer, he was determined to have a short time of pure ecstasy, a few moments of unalloyed and fearless bliss in breathing into the ear of the innocent and beautiful Nourmahal the adoration of his fond heart, the declaration of his devoted love. There could not be, there seemed no hope of escaping detection, but his heart was firm, and his purpose was determined. He would make one effort for himself and for her, and if that failed him, alas, alas! On the morning of the 7th day from receiving his commission, he entered the apartment of Nourmahal, resolved on declaring his passion. The Sultan had on the previous day shown evident signs of suspicion and displeasure at the length of time already taken by Callimachus, the more so as he reflected on the beauty of his captive. Naturally of a petulant and suspecting disposition, his anxiety and impatience seemed to increase upon this occasion to more than their ordinary strength, and with hasty and irregular steps did he pace the marble floors of his palace. In the meantime was Callimachus breathing his idolatry to the object of his heart's adoration. Kneeling before her, as she reclined upon a couch of imperial purple, did he whisper to her the fond hopes of his soul. As his heart pictured, so did his tongue utter, and as he knelt he forgot that he was surrounded by danger, nor seemed he less happy than in his brightest and most enthusiastic visions. Although Nur Mahal had been led to suspect by the manner in which he had of late addressed her what were the sentiments of his heart, yet it surprised her when she heard him reveal, in direct words, the love he bore her, nor was she less pleased. His daily appearance and kind attentions were objects to her which won her gratitude and friendship, and each day she more and more watched for the hour of his visit, and found greater pleasure in his society. With moistened eyes and a beating heart did she listen to the fond adulation of Callimachus, and when he had spoken to her all that his tongue could utter, or his heart prompt, she threw herself weeping on his neck. And as she lay within his arms, heart to heart and cheek to cheek, did the innocent girl vow to him the reciprocation of her first pure and virgin love. What a paradise to them were those first few brief moments of bliss! If the heaven of the Moslem contains aught like to it, surely there is some excuse for their wrong, though sincere worship. And now they had declared their love that in their present condition they could not enjoy. The time was fast approaching when the Sultan would learn that he had profited nothing by the visits of Callimachus, when he would consider him as of no further use as a mediator, and remove from him any opportunity of again visiting Nur Mahal. Upon this and its consequences had Callimachus reflected. He had not rushed into danger without planning some mode of escape. They both knew that to live apart would be misery to each, and that to enjoy it at all there must be a material change from the present, and he was about unfolding a scheme by which they might escape, when the door suddenly opened, and the Sultan strode into the middle of the room. Nur Mahal sprang from the arms of her lover, and hiding her face in her hands, tremblingly awaited the sound of the Sultan's voice, while Callimachus, with folded arms and a stern and lofty look, met his fierce and malignant glance, unquailed, and as he knew his doom was fixed in the Sultan's mind, he was determined to await his fate with that coolness and courageous firmness which had so conspicuously shone in the many battles he had fought for his sovereign. With ineffable scorn, hatred, and contempt did the Sultan regard the objects of his displeasure for a few moments. Then, calling a guard which was always within hearing, he said, "Take this traitor, this recreant, love-sick lord, to prison, and at noon tomorrow bring me his head, and let his dog of a carcass be taken to the plains without the city, fit only for what it will become, food for the ravenous hyenas and jackals. Away, and see that it is performed, or by the sword of the holy prophet, there is not a head among ye all that shall not share his fate." Instantly did the satraps of the Sultan surround the unfortunate Callimachus to conduct him to his prison, and as they crossed the threshold of the apartment, a loud shriek was uttered by Nur Mahal, and she fell senseless at her captor's feet. Alone and in his dungeon, Callimachus had leisure to reflect upon his fate. He knew that a limit had been set to his life, and he made up his mind to meet, with a philosophical resignation, what he knew to be inevitable. While thus reflecting upon his situation, he began to think upon the possibility of an escape. He was acquainted with every cell in the prison, and there was a glimmer. One slight ray of hope lighted up the dreariness of his condition. There was one cell from which he might escape, only one, and the hope that now remained to him was that he might be in it. Adjoining one of the cells was another, similar in construction, separated by a thick, strong wall of stone, in which was a small grated window with upright bars, to all appearance firmly set in the massive wall. In one of these had Callimachus been placed, which he ascertained by groping around in the dark. The other apartment was used for the storage of implements of torture, irons for the hands and feet of prisoners, chains, and numerous articles which had been laid aside for want of repair. As Callimachus ascertained his situation in the prison, his heart grew lighter, but there were many difficulties yet to overcome. In the first place, he had to wait for the approach of night, which he did with as much patience as he could acquire. To him it seemed the longest day he had ever passed, but it did at last roll away, and as night gathered her sable curtain around the city, an hour after hour passed away till Callimachus thought it must be midnight. He began to prepare himself for the task that was to him either life or death. He approached the grated window, and with a throbbing heart did he grasp its rusted bars. He applies his strength, his hopes increase, they yield, and give him entrance to the next apartment. Then cautiously did he grope his way to the foot of a flight of steps which led to the floor above his prison. His foot was upon the first step, the second, the third. He mounted to the top. He listened. Not a sound fell upon his ear. He put his hand upon the door, and for a moment he hesitated, for upon the chance of its being unfastened depended all his hopes of escaping. He hardly dared venture to try it, for he trembled between hope and fear, and one moment would either increase his hopes or sink him in the lowest despondency. With a sudden effort he brought his mind to a point of determination. He recollected that it was frequently unlocked, for the jailer was ignorant of any secret communication between that cell and those occupied for the detention of prisoners. There was but one besides himself who knew the secret, and that one was in Ispahan. He tried the door. It opened, and the fresh air played on his face. He stepped softly into the entrance hall of the prison. The door that opened upon the street was ajar, as though some person had but for a moment gone out. To avail himself of this opportunity was but the thought of an instant, and rushing into the street he sped onward as fast as his feet would carry him, nor did he stop till without the city, and free from the tyrant's grasp. The first thought of Callimachus when he found himself safe was to revenge himself upon the Sultan, and secure his beloved Nur Mahal from a worse fate than had awaited himself. He pursued his way into Khorasan, enlisted the nobles on his side, and in a short time was enabled to raise an army sufficient to make Ben Yusef tremble. It was a time when rival chieftains fought in their sovereign's name their own battles, and the country on one side was ravaged with the Uzbeks and on the other by the Ottomans. With a powerful army, raised by the friendship of the reigning prince or governor of Khorasan, he marched into the province of Fars. The success of his arms was complete. He had beaten the Sultan's troops in every instance, and at last encamped at night, within a day's march of Shiraz, in an open plain, and in view of which reposed the main army of the Sultan, commanded by himself, after a weary day's march, upon an eminence within a mile of them. The decisive battle was yet to be fought, and no sooner had the light of the following morn began to appear than both armies were busy in preparing for the ensuing contest. At last the signal for the onset was given, and the opposing forces met. The Sultan himself led on the van of his army, and presented a fair opportunity for the marksmen of the invaders, but every javelin fell harmless, every weapon turned from him, and he fought with the ferocity of a tiger. The victory seemed doubtful, many fell on both sides, and the slaughter was becoming immense, when the attention of the armies was directed to a place where the two leaders were engaged in severe combat face to face, the Sultan and Callimachus. For a while it seemed doubtful which would be the victor, but the youth and coolness of Callimachus prevailed, and one blow of his keen scimitar clove the tyrant's skull, and in a short time after the whole army capitulated, and the conquering Callimachus entered Shiraz as its lord and master, who but a short time before made his escape from it a fugitive. His first act was to seek Nur Mahal and claim her, without the fear of a rival, for his blushing bride. He found her in the room where he had last seen her, still a captive, but pure and unstained. She shrieked for joy when she saw him enter, and fell swooning into his arms. The rest is soon told. They were shortly after united, and lived long and happily together, beloved by the people whom they governed, and respected by their friends. End of section 4.
Section 5 of the Rover, Volume 1, Number 3. This is LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Kate Follis. The Rover, Volume 1, Number 3. Edited by Seba Smith and Lawrence Labree. Section 5. The Necromancer. Ho, sorcerer, magician, come forth! These outcries proceeded from a party of young men just returned from witnessing the funeral of Charles VII at St. Denis, and who were knocking violently at a door on the top of a dark and winding staircase in the Rue Saint-Pierre. They were replied to by a feeble and broken voice, but they heard it not, so vociferously did they call, "What? Necromancer!" At last the door was slowly opened by the object of their search. "What seek ye, my children?" "We would know the future, and thou canst dive into each man's destiny, thou high priest of the evil one, king of sorcerers. Come and tell us quickly, and see that the intelligence be to our liking, for it needs none of thy skill to know that our rapiers have sharp points," repeated Maunde Therbran, the eldest of the party, as he directed an inquiring though fearful glance into the old man's mysterious dwelling. It was only lighted by a small lamp, the glimmering flame of which scarcely enabled him to distinguish, in one corner of it, a human skeleton, in another a heap of dusty books. On the floor, spheres and astrolabes, and fixed to the ceiling between two beams, an immense white stuffed owl, whose large eyes glared with peculiar brilliancy, although reflected only by the feeble light of the lamp. All this produced a fearful effect upon the susceptible mind of Maunde, already predisposed to the supernatural, and a positive belief in the old man's power. He was unable to withdraw his gaze from those two large round eyes which were glittering in the shade, and stood wrapped in the deepest thought, when he was at length aroused by the loud and boisterous laugh of his companions, who were taunting the old man for his want of skill. When Maunde's turn came, he hesitated, till, jeered by his comrades, he at last held out his hand, but it was observed that his manner was grave, and his air thoughtful. "Maunde!" exclaimed the old man, and he had not told his name. "Maunde," he murmured between his teeth, and he whispered some words in his ear inaudible to the others of the party. "What has he said to you?" eagerly inquired his companions, but Maunde was silent, and quitted the place, pale as death. The next morning Maunde's first thought was of the necromancer. All night long he had beheld him in his dreams. The low voice of the magician still murmured in his ear, and when he awoke from his troubled sleep, the last word still vibrated in his ears. "Am I then reserved for that? And must I then—" he inwardly exclaimed, and his noble heart revolted at his own conjurings. "And who told me this? A wretch who luxuriates upon the credulity of mankind, who attacks my purse through the medium of my fears. I am a fool to think of it." He arose and went out, but nothing could divert him. Even in the streets he seemed to see but the sorcerer, and to hear but his fatal words. Timid by nature and weakened by the excesses of his life, the effects of the sorcerer's prediction, acting upon an enfeebled mind, acquired an all-powerful intensity. After wandering through the street till past the hour of noon, striving to escape from the horrible idea that pursued him, he sought some of his companions of the preceding evening, but society he found was a burden to him. He therefore quitted them to wander alone in the fields. The sun was bright, but to him the heavens appeared clouded. A balmy and refreshing breeze played around him, but he felt not its soothing power. His heart was chilled. One dark, freezing, dreadful idea haunted his imagination. As he was retracing his steps to his lodgings, in that despairing mood that takes possession of the mind when nature has no longer any charms for us, and was on the point of crossing the grave, he suddenly stopped short, for he beheld a newly erected scaffold. With a convulsive shudder he turned aside. It reminded him of the words of the sorcerer. He could no longer sleep in the Rue Saint-Laude, which was opposite the grave. He therefore quitted the capital and took up his residence in a habitation situated between Paris and Montmartre. There he saw but little, and heard but little. It seemed to him like the silence of the desert at the very gates of a populous city, and there he hoped that his troubled imagination might have recovered its tone and tranquillity, and the dreadful words of the necromancer might be gradually weakened from the mysterious power they had acquired over him. But alas! They had found a ready echo within his breast, always ready to repeat them. The house was inhabited by an old couple and their daughter, the idolized child of their old age. She was truly beautiful. She had one of those Madonna heads that an ideal style of beauty, such as genius in its happiest moments of inspiration, conceives. Black hair plaited across her forehead, lustrous dark eyes, and a complexion pale and transparent as the finest alabaster. Such was this young maiden, who with her parents lived like Monda, in a state of utter seclusion from the world. No one even knew their names. Once he heard the old father address his daughter by the name of Nicole. Nicole became for him a beloved name, that at times could make him forget his cherished sorrow. Love dawned in his bosom, and every sombre idea was eclipsed by its dazzling rays. Nicole, the beautiful Nicole. She haunted him in his dreams, in his meditations, even in his prayers, and if he could only catch a glimpse of her as she crossed like a spirit before him, it was for him a day of happiness. He then thought himself delivered, and oh, how dearly he loved the object who had dissipated the horrid phantoms and gloomy terrors of his imagination. Often did he steal toward her and bless her in the soft language of love. One Sunday morning he met her in the church of the Abbey of Montmartre. She was on her knees and praying so fervently that he felt she must possess a confiding, a loving heart, and when she raised her head and met his earnest gaze, her pale cheek was slightly tinged with a blush, and in that timid look there was so much piety and tenderness that he said to himself, "Surely that is love." Nor was he mistaken. She did indeed love Monda. She had loved him long and in secret, and she revealed it in her glance. He passed that night reveling on the delicious belief that he was not alone in the world, that he was beloved, and in the joy of the moment it seemed to him that he had only to ask her in marriage of her parents and obtain her. He therefore resolved to take this step in the morning. He could dread no refusal, and he pictured to himself the paradise of a home, of the joys of love, of felicity. "If happiness is to be found in this world," he mentally exclaimed, "surely this is happiness." But suddenly these golden reveries were dissipated by the recollection of the fatal words of the sorcerer. They came like a damp upon his heart and froze his very blood. "Happiness," he sighed forth. "Happiness, did I say?" he bitterly exclaimed. "No, no, not for me, not for the doomed. Never shall I taste of happiness." His bright hopes deserted him, and he lapsed into his former gloomy imaginings, which the enchantment of 2 months' love had partially banished from his mind. The dreadful words of the necromancer appeared to him more inevitable than ever. His wife then would press to her bosom one cursed by heaven, one already branded by fate, and doomed to... His very soul shrunk within him as the word rushed with tenfold force upon his recollection, and he raved in his anguish and denounced the Almighty, whom he fancied had cast him to irrevocable doom. That very morning he disappeared. Evening came, but he returned not. Day after day passed, and month after month, but Monda came not again. Nicole tenderly loved him, for she wept bitterly and vowed she would never marry. The neighbors, on his disappearance, recollecting his dejected air and moody habits, supposed that he had made away with himself. Nicole trembled at the very idea. A suicide? One whom she had loved so dearly? She could not believe it. And yet, could she have known the truth, she would have found that the fear of an hereafter had alone withheld the poniard from his bosom. Devotion had that once saved him from despair. It was on the 1st of May, 1465, that Monde once more entered Paris. He had been absent 5 years. The thought of Nicole still haunted him, and he longed to see her bright, angelic face once more, for he had returned from over the sea to worship at the shrine of his first love. He had retained his residence near Montmartre, and trembling he directed his steps thither. He was obliged to traverse the quarter of the Follis to reach it, and had made a detour to avoid the Place de Grève, so hateful to him. He was just entering the Rue de Garnelles, when the sound of music attracted his attention, and he perceived a crowd of people approaching. He made some inquiries of a bystander, who told him that it was a marriage, the nuptials of the son of Henry Cousin, the executioner of Paris, and of the daughter of Mary Capeluche, the retired executioner of the city of Rouen. "A splendid and well-assorted match, truly, Sir Stranger," said the man with a grin. Monde shuddered at the words spoken so lightly, but with such awful meaning to himself. The fatal words rung in his ears as plainly as on the night of his first carousal. He had long since become convinced of their truth, and with gloomy tranquillity he awaited his time. The idea had become his faith, his creed, the very breath of his life. So powerfully was he absorbed in his belief that he no longer wrestled with it, no longer endeavored to shake off the delusion which had assumed to his diseased imagination all the circumstance of reality. It even impelled him onward, and by a mysterious and invisible influence urged him to anticipate its fulfillment. He walked onward. The mirth and gaiety of the crowd was sickening to him. He wished to avoid the people, but the procession was close upon him, and he stood to see it pass. The bride and bridegroom were returning from the nuptial benedictions, greeted by the plaudits of the populace. Monde cast a hurried glance at the principal personage of the pageant, when, instead of turning with his usual disgust at anything like rejoicing, his gaze became fixed. His eyes were riveted upon that face. The blood forsook his countenance, his lips quivered, he covered his face with his hands, and looked again, as one bewildered. Good God! Was it an apparition, or was it a dreadful reality? It was too true. The beautiful, the adored Nicole was there before him, the daughter and wife of an executioner? He staggered against the wall for support. Yes. Then was she more beautiful than when he first saw her, the only bright gleam in his dark and troubled life? It was all over. If in his hours of reflection he might have entertained some doubts of the horrible fate that hung over him, they had vanished at a single glance. From that moment a species of monomania seized on him. Every place of punishment had a charm for him. It was a bloody magnet that attracted him. The gibbet of Montfaucon, that of Montigny, the scaffolds erected in the Place de Grève and in the Follis he visited every day. He no longer went to pray, but in the church of Saint Jean de Grève, where the condemned are prepared for death, and where they heard their last mass. Days of happiness had followed the nuptials which had overwhelmed Monde with such sudden terror. Petit Jehan loved his beautiful Nicole more and more, who had given him a boy, the image of his mother. Never was child so caressed and beloved, and he was growing in all the happiness and repose of innocent childhood, while Monde, who had adored his mother, was struggling with the anguish of a life that had been insupportable. 4 years had elapsed since he saw Nicole on her way from the altar. One cloudy day, Monde quitted his retreat. He had become a misanthrope, and shunned the light of day. He entered Paris by the street of Le Porte Montmartre. His pace was irregular. His right hand covered his forehead, across which passed clouds as dark as those which obscured the horizon. He had passed a terrible night. He felt that his hour had at length arrived, that a powerful and irresistible hand was urging him to his fate, while a voice whispered continually in his ear the same words that he heard the sorcerer utter. Despair was in his look. His face was wild and haggard, his hands were dry and hot. A fire was burning within him, and his throat was parched. A horrible desire came over him. He felt that he could only quench his consuming thirst in blood. A young man approached him. He was attired gaily, as though he were going to some festival. A smile was on his countenance, and he was humming a chansonnette. With the frightful instinct of his distemper, Monda had unclasped a knife with a long, thin blade. The expression of his countenance was fiendish, and, as though aware of his repulsive aspect, he shielded it from the light of day by his broad, slouched hat. But the feeling of his better nature came over him. "Shall I," muttered he, "shall I send a soul to his last account, perhaps with crime upon his head? His eternal punishment will be added to my weight of guilt. No, no, some other victim more innocent than he." And he was proceeding along, casting about him furious glances of deadly import. "Ha!" said he, "shall I strike that young maiden? She has the very look of purity and innocence." As he spoke these words, a young girl came bounding onward. The glow of health and beauty was on her cheek, and her eyes seemed lighted up with joy and love. "But what if I pierce two hearts in one?" he muttered. "She has perhaps an expectant lover. At a single blow I shall destroy two. The scaffold demands not that." He reached the corner of la Rue de Grenelle. At 50 paces from him was a group of children, playing in all the innocency of childhood. How joyous their cries, how sparkling their eyes, how graceful their movements. It was the beau ideal of joyous life. Monde suddenly stopped, and riveted his glance upon the youngest of the group with flowing chestnut curls and rosy cheeks. "He is an innocent soul, pure as the wings of angels. I can do no injury to him. He is as an angel that I shall send back to paradise. Poor little one, I shall perhaps save thee from many evils, perhaps from crime. How sweet to snatch a human being from the sight of such torments as mine." While thus holding fearful converse with himself, he advanced gradually toward the children, who, excited by his presence, played with renewed ardor. Monde was now within a few paces of the children. 3 or 4 of them ran toward him and sought to attract his attention by their innocent gambols. Once he was on the point of retracing his steps, but he could not. He knew his time was come. The children gathered round him, and all addressed him at once. He lifted up in his arms the little creature with the chestnut curls. "Oh, he is only 4 years old. He is the youngest of us all," exclaimed his little companions. "He is only 4 years old. He is the youngest and the most innocent," said Monde to himself, and as he encircled him with one of his arms, his dreadful mania came strongly over him. Blood was in his thought. He thirsted only for blood, and his eyes gleamed with the dreadful insanity. The little innocent was frightened at his looks. "Let me go," he cried, struggling to get free. "Let me go and play." But Monde clutched him convulsively toward him and plunged the long knife deep in his heart. A stream of blood bubbled from the wound, and the little creature gasped and fell dead with his tiny white arms circling the neck of his murderer. The laughter of the children was quickly transformed into cries of terror at the sight of the blood. The neighbors ran to the spot, but Monda made not the slightest attempt to escape. He had fulfilled his destiny. The watch arrived and seized Monda, who a few days afterward was condemned by Monsieur Robert d'Itreville, provost of Paris, to die upon the scaffold. On the day following the trial, the condemned, carrying a lighted torch, proceeded barefooted to the place of execution before the gates of Notre Dame. As he passed along to the fatal spot, the imprecations of the women were dreadful. Maternal love assumed a savage tenderness that eloquently burst forth. The mothers embraced their little ones and pressed them wildly to their bosoms as the assassin passed along. Having at length reached the foot of the scaffold, Monda ascended the steps with a firm composure. He was supported by the innate conviction that he had obeyed a law that was inevitable, and he found himself standing face to face to a young executioner whom he had never seen before. They stood alone above the immense crowd below. "Come, little Jehan, this is your first essay. Remember, a father ought not to miss the assassin of his child." These encouraging words proceeded from Master Henri Cousin, his sire, and from Master Mary Capeluche, who bore the same affinity to Nicole. It was her child that he had slain. All was prepared. Little Jehan waved his thirsty sabre round his head, and as it made its fatal descent, the last mortal words that shook the ears of the unfortunate Monda was a hoarse, guttural laugh, which proceeded from the old necromancer at the foot of the scaffold. His prediction was fulfilled. Monda died upon the scaffold. End of section 5. End of the Rover, Volume 1, Number 3, edited by Seba Smith and Lawrence Labree.